The piercing screech of a police car's tires shattered the early morning calm, grinding to a halt at the dusty corner where Marcus Evans and his son Elijah stood waiting for the school bus. The air buzzed with the hum of the waking city, exhaust fumes swirling around them like a thick, invisible fog that clung to their clothes and stung their lungs. Yet, that choking haze paled in comparison to the suffocating tension about to descend. Elijah, a weary 14-year-old with a mop of curls and eyes that sparkled with youthful curiosity, gripped his worn school bag tightly against his chest, his small knuckles whitening around the straps. In his other hand, he clutched a crumpled dollar bill, its edges frayed from being nervously twisted between his fingers, a modest treasure, earned from a week of chores. His heart thudded faintly, not yet aware of the storm brewing just steps away. Marcus, towering beside him, stood like an oak rooted deep in the earth, his broad shoulders squared and his dark eyes scanning the street with the quiet vigilance of a man who'd seen too much. The sun glinted off the faint lines etched into his face, a map of years spent balancing duty and dignity. He wore a simple jacket, the kind that blended into the crowd, but beneath it, the edge of his sheriff's badge peeked out an unspoken testament to the authority he carried. Though he rarely flaunted it, that morning, he'd chosen to walk Elijah to the stop, a ritual born of love rather than necessity. He savored these moments, the soft crunch of gravel under their shoes, the way Elijah's voice bubbled with questions about the world. Marcus had always believed in shielding his son's light, that boundless wonder that reminded him why he fought so hard to make their corner of the city a little fairer. The patrol car door swung open with a groan, and out stepped an officer whose presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air. His heavy boots slammed against the pavement, each step ringing with a deliberate thud that echoed his unshakable confidence. Sunglasses perched on his nose, he tilted his head, catching Elijah's wide-eyed reflection in the dark lenses. The boy froze, his breath catching as the man loomed closer, his shadow stretching long and menacing across the cracked sidewalk. Well, what do we have here?" the officer drawled, his voice slick with suspicion as he sized Elijah up, his gaze lingering on the boy's faded sneakers and the dollar bill trembling in his grasp. He didn't wait for a response, it didn't seem to care for one. "You look like trouble. Empty your pockets, kid." Now, Marcus shifted, his calm exterior unshaken, but his pulse quickening beneath it. He stepped forward, placing himself between the officer and his son, his voice steady as a riverbed stone. "Is there a problem, officer? My son hasn't done anything wrong." His words were measured, laced with a quiet strength that demanded respect, though he knew better than to expect it from a man like this. The officer's head snapped toward Marcus, his lips curling into a sneer as he adjusted his stance, one hand resting casually on his belt. "I wasn't talking to you," he snapped, his tone dripping with disdain, sharp enough to cut through the morning stillness. "Unless you're looking for trouble yourself, I suggest you back off." He flicked a dismissive hand toward Elijah. "Come on, kid, let's see what you're hiding." Elijah's eyes darted to his father, uncertainty flickering in their depths. His small frame trembled, not from cold but from the sudden weight of a scrutiny he didn't understand. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, a slow burn igniting in his chest as he watched his son's innocence collide with the officer's arrogance. Before he could speak again, the officer lunged forward, snatching Elijah's arm with a grip that made the boy wince. "What's this?" he barked, yanking the dollar bill free and holding it up like a trophy. "Where'd you get this? Stole it, didn't you? I'd bet my badge you did." His voice was a mocking growl, each word laced with accusation as he dangled the bill in front of Elijah's flushed face. The boy's voice cracked, a fragile thread of sound barely audible over the distant rumble of traffic. "No, sir. I didn't steal it. It's my allowance." His lips quivered, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes as he fought to hold them back. He hated how small he felt, how the officer's shadow seemed to swallow him whole. The man scoffed, a harsh, grating laugh spilling from his throat as he waved the dollar in the air. "Allowance? Kids like you don't get allowances. This is stolen, no doubt about it." With a smirk that twisted his face into something cruel, he folded the bill and slipped it into his pocket. "Consider it confiscated." Marcus's blood roared in his ears, a tidal wave of fury crashing against the dam of his restraint. His hands flexed at his sides, itching to act, but he held himself still, every muscle taut with the effort. His eyes burned into the officer, twin embers glowing with a rage he rarely let surface. He could feel Elijah's trembling fingers clutch his arm, the boy's breath hitching as humiliation painted his cheeks red. "Officer, you have no right," Marcus said, his voice low and deliberate, each syllable a warning. But the officer cut him off, stepping closer until their faces were inches apart. "I have every right," he spat, his breath hot with authority. "Step back now, or I'll arrest you for obstructing justice." The air thickened with the weight of the moment, a palpable shame settling over them like dust. Around them, the street stirred passerby slowing their steps, their whispers weaving a web of curiosity and judgment. An old woman with a grocery bag paused, her brow furrowing as she clutched her purse tighter. A young man on a bike lingered, his head tilted as he strained to hear, torn between stepping in and staying invisible. Their murmurs buzzed like flies, amplifying Elijah's quiet sobs as he pressed himself against his father's side. But the officer reveled in it, his chest puffing out as if the attention fueled him. His smug grin stretched wider, a predator savoring the kill, as he turned to leave. "Next time," he called over his shoulder, his voice a taunting echo. "Teach your kid not to walk around looking suspicious. Maybe he'll stay out of trouble." Marcus didn't move, his feet planted firm as he tracked the officer's swagger back to the car. The man's arrogance hung in the air like a stench, but Marcus's face remained a mask of stone. Inside, though, a tempest ragged danger, yes, but also a cold, calculated resolve. He rested a hand on Elijah's shoulder, feeling the boy's shudders beneath his palm, and took a deep breath, grounding himself in the promise he'd made long ago, to protect his son from a world that too often saw him as less than human. The patrol car peeled away, its engine roaring with the officer's misplaced triumph, oblivious to the fire he'd just stoked. What the officer hadn't seen, what his blind hubris had obscured, was the glint of metal beneath Marcus's jacket. This wasn't just a father, this was a sheriff, a man who'd spent decades navigating the law's intricacies, mastering its rules and exposing its flaws. He knew the system inside out, every loophole, every protocol, every shield men like that officer hid behind. But this wasn't about statutes or badges. This was visceral, personal. A wound reopened, a line crossed. The officer thought he'd walked away unscathed, another petty victory notched on his belt. He couldn't have been more wrong. As they turned from the corner, Marcus guided Elijah away, his touch gentle but firm. The boy's head hung low, his school bag dragging against the ground, each step heavy with the sting of shame. Marcus's mind, though, was a whirlwind of plans, each thought clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. He wouldn't shout, wouldn't lash out in the heat of the moment. That wasn't his way. Instead, he'd dismantle the officer's world piece by piece, using the very tools the man thought protected him. This was about justice, and not just for Elijah, but for every kid who'd felt that same crushing weight, every family stripped of dignity by those meant to serve. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a sharp vibration that cut through the fog of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and determined, the kind that promised reckoning. Contacts were already moving, whispers spreading through the channels he'd built over years. The officer had no idea what was coming, nor did the department that enabled him. The community, too, would soon turn its eyes to the fallout, watching as a father's quiet fury unraveled secrets long buried. How far would Marcus go to restore his son's honor? What shadows would spill into the light when the officer's deeds were laid bare? This wasn't just a lesson in consequence, it was a testament to resilience, a warning that power, when abused, ignites forces it cannot contain. As they walked, the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them. Elijah glanced up, his voice soft but steady. "Dad, are you okay?" Marcus squeezed his shoulder, his gaze fixed ahead. "We're going to be just fine, son." And in his heart, he knew it was true, not because the path would be easy, but because he'd walk it to the end. For Elijah, for justice, for the day no child would have to feel that powerless again. The twists ahead would shock them all. But Marcus was ready. The tables were turning, and the officer's smug world was about to crack wide open. The morning air carried a faint chill as Marcus and Elijah strolled side by side, their footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. These walks, though often brief, were a sacred ritual for Marcus. They were his chance to peel back the layers of the world with his son, to weave conversations that dance between the sprawling tales of history and the intricate details of Elijah's latest science projecta contraption of wires and gears that had taken over their garage for weeks. Each moment spent together stitched a tighter bond between them, a fragile yet resilient thread that Marcus held close to his heart. Beneath his calm demeanor, though, a quiet storm brewed. His eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned their surroundings with the instincts of a man who'd spent years navigating life's unpredictable lifters as a black man in a world that often refused to see him, then as a sheriff who'd witnessed how quickly safety could unravel into chaos. The bus stop sat nestled at a tranquil corner, framed by ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches stretched out like silent sentinels. Their leaves whispered faintly in the breeze, bearing witness to centuries of stories untold. Elijah, always punctual, loved arriving early just to catch the bus, but to steal a few minutes with his friends, their laughter a bright spot in the morning's stillness. As they lingered there, Marcus glanced at his watch, the ticking hands a steady rhythm against the quiet. His gaze swept the area, a habit carved deep from his days patrolling streets and deciphering threats hidden in the mundane. Nothing seemed amiss today, no shadows lurking, no tension humming in the air, just a father and son, wrapped in the simplicity of routine. Elijah fidgeted beside him, digging into his pocket with a small grunt of effort. He pulled out a crumpled dollar bill, the last remnant of his weekly allowance, its edges worn from being folded and unfolded a dozen times. Holding it up, he squinted at it as if it might reveal some hidden secret. "Dad," he said, his voice tinged with the exasperation only a 12-year-old could muster, "do you think the vending machines at school will ever take cards? I mean, who even carries cash anymore? It's such a hassle." Marcus chuckled, the sound warm and low, a balm against the morning's chill. "You've got a good point, kid. But I reckon they're trying to teach you something about managing money the old school way makes. You think twice before you spend it all on candy." Elijah rolled his eyes, but a grin tugged at his lips, their familiar banter a comfort they both leaned into. That ease shattered in an instant. A harsh screech tore through the stillness, tires grinding against pavement as a police cruiser jerked to a stop at the curb. Its sudden, aggressive arrival felt like a violation, a jagged crack splitting the serenity of the scene. Marcus's body tensed, every muscle coiling as if bracing for impact. He knew that car had seen it too many times rolling through town, with its occupants' swaggering arrogance. His stomach churned with a sinking certainty whatever came next wouldn't be good. Elijah froze beside him, his grin fading as the weight of the moment pressed down. Officer Greg Daniels emerged from the cruiser, his heavy boots thudding against the ground with deliberate force. He carried himself like a man who'd weaponized his badge, his broad shoulders squared and his jaw set in a way that screamed intimidation. Marcus knew him too well, a lazy cop who coasted through paperwork but leapt at any chance to wield his authority like a club. Daniels had a reputation in the department, whispered about in break rooms and locker rows, a bully who preyed on those he deemed weak, especially anyone whose skin didn't match his own pale complexion. His eyes, cold and unyielding, locked onto them as he approached, each step radiating a menace that made Elijah shift nervously, his sneakers scuffing the dirt. Marcus rested a hand on his son's shoulder, the touch firm yet gentle, a silent anchor in the rising storm. "Stay calm," he murmured, his voice a steady thread meant to tether Elijah to safety. "I've got this." But inside, his pulse quickened, a drumbeat of dread and defiance. Daniels didn't hesitate, his voice slicing through the air like a jagged edge. "What's going on here? You two waiting for something?" His gaze slid past Marcus, dismissing him entirely, and settled on Elijah with a predatory focus. "You look like you've got something you shouldn't. Kid, let's see what's in those pockets." Elijah's eyes widened, a flicker of panic darting across his face as he glanced up at his father. Marcus stepped forward, planting himself between his son and the officer, his tone calm but edged with steel. "Officer, my son isn't carrying anything illegal. There's no reason for this." Daniels smirked, a twisted curl of his lips that dripped with disdain. "I wasn't talking to you. Kid, empty your pockets now or I'll do it myself." The threat hung heavy, a dark cloud swelling over them. Marcus felt his fists tighten at his sides, nails biting into his palms as he fought to keep his composure. He knew the stakes, knew how fast a moment like this could spiral into something irreparable. "Officer," he said again, his voice rising slightly, "there's no justification here. He's done nothing wrong." Daniels ignored him, his hand shooting out to grab Elijah's arm. The boy flinched, a sharp intake of breath escaping him as he recoiled from the rough grip. Marcus moved instinctively, his body a shield as he snapped, "That's enough. You're crossing a line." But Daniels wasn't listening. With a quick, dismissive yank, he snatched the dollar bill from Elijah's trembling fingers, holding it aloft like a trophy plucked from a battlefield. "Allowance, huh?" he sneered, his voice thick with mockery. "Sure doesn't look like it. Kids like you don't come by money this way." Time stretched into an agonizing eternity, each second a slow drip of venom. Elijah's face flushed red, a storm of anger and shame swirling in his wide eyes as he stared at the ground. Marcus's chest ached, a raw, searing pain at watching his son stripped of dignity over a single, crumpled dollar. Daniels pocketed the bill with a smug grin, his arrogance a slap against their humanity. "Consider this evidence," he drawled, his tone oozing with satisfaction. "Next time, don't look so suspicious." Then he turned, strutting back to his cruiser with the swagger of a man untouchable, and peeled away without a backward glance. Elijah's voice broke the silence, quivering with a mix of hurt and fury. "Dad, why didn't you stop him? He just took it." The words pierced Marcus like a blade, each syllable a plea for answers he wasn't sure he could give. He knelt down, meeting his son's gaze, the weight of the moment pressing against his ribs. "I'm sorry, Elijah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't deserve that. None of this was right. But I promise you, this isn't over." Elijah's lip trembled, his small frame hunched as they turned from the bus stop, the Oaks standing silent witness to their retreat. The drive home was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken words. Marcus stole glances at Elijah through the rearview mirror, the boy's face a tight mask of frustration, his eyes fixed on the window as the world blurred past. Anger simmered beneath his son's silence, a fire Marcus could feel even from the driver's seat. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, his mind racing with a torrent of thoughts. This wasn't just about a dollar, it was about the countless times justice had been trampled under the boots of men like Daniels, about the lessons Elijah would carry from this day forward. As a sheriff, Marcus had the power to fight back, to demand accountability. But as a father, he felt the sting of failure, the gnawing fear that he hadn't shielded his son from the world's cruelty. When they reached home, Elijah bolted from the car, his footsteps heavy as he stormed inside. The slam of his bedroom door reverberated through the house, a sharp echo of his pain. Marcus stood in the kitchen, setting his keys on the counter with a clatter, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the morning. Angela emerged from the living room, her presence a quiet force as she studied his face. She knew him, knew the lines etched deeper into his brow, the storm brewing in his dark eyes. "What happened?" Her voice was steady, but laced with a fierce undercurrent, a mother's instinct already sensing the wound. Marcus exhaled, dragging a hand over his face as if he could wipe away the memory. He recounted at Alt Cruiser's jarring rival, Danielle's venomous words, the theft of Elijah's dignity over a measly dollar. Angela's expression hardened with every detail, her lips thinning into a tight line, her arms crossing over her chest like a shield. She leaned against the counter, her silence a brewing tempest. When he finished, she spoke, her tone cutting through the stillness. "This isn't the first time, Marcus, and we both know it won't be the last. Daniels. Men like him they abuse power because they can. What are we going to do?" Her words hung between them, a challenge and a plea. Marcus met her gaze, his resolve hardening like steel in a forge. He thought of Elijah upstairs, wrestling with a hurt no child should bear, and of every other kid who'd faced Danielle's cruelty. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a promise, a fight worth waging. The lesson here stretched beyond one morning. Power, unchecked, devoured the vulnerable. But it could be met with consequence. Marcus wouldn't let this fade into silence. For Elijah, for their community, he'd wield his own authority not as a weapon, but as a beacon. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, but he'd walk it, step by determined step, until his son could see that right could still prevail. The gravity of Angela's words pressed down on Marcus like a leaden cloak, each syllable sinking into his bones with an ache he couldn't shake. Her voice carried the weight of years of frustration, a quiet storm brewing behind her steady gaze. "I'm going to handle it," he said, his tone low and firm, cutting through the air like a blade. There was no room for debate in his words, no crack for doubt to slip through. But Angela wasn't so easily swayed. Her brow furrowed, and her lips parted with a question that hung heavy between them. "Handle it how?" she pressed, her voice sharp with skepticism. "By filing a complaint. You've seen how that ends up. Nothing changes. They'll shield him, just like they always do. And Elijah, he'll be left to carry the truth that no one fought for him." Marcus felt his jaw clench, a tight knot of muscle pulsing beneath his skin. He hated how right she washated the bitter taste of her truth. He'd witnessed it too many times, officers like Daniel gliding through life untouched, their misdeeds brushed aside or buried deep in the system's shadows. The precinct was a machine, oiled with loyalty and silence, and Daniel was one of its favored sons. But this time, something was different. This time, it wasn't just another name on a report, it was Elijah, his Elijah. Marcus's chest tightened as he met Angela's gaze. "I have to try," he said at last, his voice steady as stone. "Not just for Elijah, but for every kid who's been crushed under this. I won't let Daniel walk away from it, not this time." Angela held his stare for a long moment, her eyes searching his for something gristle, perhaps, or a flicker of the man she knew he could be. Finally, she gave a small nod, a silent concession, though her parting words lingered like a warning. "Just make sure you're ready for what comes next." Later that evening, the soft glow of a bedside lamp spilled across Elijah's room as Marcus tapped lightly on the door frame. He stepped inside, the creak of the floorboards under his boots breaking the oppressive quiet. Elijah sat hunched on the edge of his bed, his thin frame curled inward, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes stayed glued to the worn carpet, tracing the threads as if they held answers he couldn't find. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Marcus's presence, and the silence stretched taut between them, thick with unspoken pain. Marcus hesitated, then lowered himself onto the bed beside his son, the mattress dipping under his weight. He rubbed a hand over his face, gathering the words he needed, words that felt too small for the hurt he saw in Elijah's slumped shoulders. "Elijah," he started, his voice gentle but unwavering, like a lighthouse cutting through fog. "I know what happened today wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And I'm so sorry you had to go through that." At last, Elijah lifted his head, and the look in his eyes hit Marcus like a frustration, betrayal, a storm of emotions no 14-year-old should have to carry. "Why didn't you stop him?" Elijah's voice cracked, sharp and accusing. "You just stood there. You let him take my money, treat me like I was nothing, like I was some criminal. And you didn't do anything." Each word landed like a blow, and Marcus felt them reverberate through his chest, guilt twisting deep in his gut. He wanted to explain, to say he'd frozen to keep things from spiraling, that confronting Daniel then and there might have put Elijah in worse danger. But those excuses felt hollow, useless against the sting of his son's humiliation Marcus had witnessed, and failed to stop. "I didn't step in, because I needed to keep you safe," Marcus said carefully, measuring each word. "But that doesn't mean I'm letting him off the hook. I'm going to make this right, Elijah. I promise you that." Elijah didn't reply, his lips pressed into a thin line, but a faint glimmer of hope flickered in his dark eyes, fragile, tentative, but there. Marcus reached out, resting a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the tension coiled beneath the boy's skin. "You're stronger than you know," he said softly, "and I need you to trust me on this, okay?" Elijah gave a reluctant nod, barely perceptible, and Marcus rose to his feet, his mind already racing with the battle ahead. Taking on Daniel meant challenging a system built to protect its own, a labyrinth of loyalty and lies. But as he left the room, Determination settled over him like armor. This was a fight he couldn't walk away from. The next morning, Marcus strode into the precinct with a purpose that radiated from his squared shoulders and measured steps. The usual hum of conversation faltered as he crossed the room, his colleagues' eyes tracking him, some curious, others wary. Beneath his calm exterior, a fire smoldered, fueled by the memory of Elijah's accusing gaze. He made his way to his office, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that echoed like a gavel. Moments later, a sharp knock broke the stillness, and Laura Mitchell, his deputy, stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She carried herself with the easy confidence of someone who'd seen it all, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in Marcus's expression. "You've got that look," she said, dropping into the chair across from his desk, her tone teasing but laced with concern, like a man about to charge into a war zone. "What's going on?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, hands clasped tightly in front of him, his knuckles whitening. "I need everything you've got on Greg Daniel," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Complaints, reports, anything tucked away in the files, especially the stuff that's been buried." Laura's eyebrow arched, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she masked it with a wry smile. "That's a big ask, Marcus. Daniel's not exactly a saint, but digging into him? That's kicking a hornet's nest. You sure you want the trouble?" Marcus met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm not worried about trouble. I'm worried about accountability. He crossed a line yesterday, and I'm done letting it slide." Laura studied him, her fingers tapping idly on the armrest. Then she nodded, a spark of respect glinting in her eyes. "All right, I'll see what I can dig up. Just watch your back, Marcus. You know how this place works." As Laura slipped out, closing the door behind her, Marcus felt the enormity of his decision settle over him like a storm cloud. He knew the pushback would come in it just from Daniel, but from the old guard who'd see this as a betrayal of the brotherhood. Yet the image of Elijah's wounded expression anchored him, a reminder of why he couldn't turn back. Over the next few days, Marcus plunged into Daniel's history, peeling back layers of a record stained with arrogance and abuse. Complaints from shaken citizens, half-hearted warnings from supervisors, even reports of misconduct that had vanished from the system like smoke. Each discovery fueled his anger, painting a portrait of a man who'd wielded power like a blunt weapon. This wasn't just about one rogue cop, it was about a system that had propped him up, shielding him from the consequences he deserved. With every file he unearthed, Marcus's plan took shape. He couldn't topple Daniel. Alana needed allies. He reached out to voices in the community, a fiery activist named Clara, whose passion for justice matched her quick wit, a soft-spoken pastor, Reverend Tate, whose quiet strength drew people in, and even a few officers who'd grown weary of the precinct's rot. Slowly, a coalition formed, fragile but determined. But Daniel wasn't oblivious. He noticed the shift, sidelong glances, the conversations that hushed when he approached. His smirking confidence began to crack, replaced by a simmering paranoia. He knew Marcus was the architect of this reckoning, and he wasn't about to let his kingdom crumble without a fight. The tension between them thickened with every passing day, their brief encounters charged with unspoken threats. In the hallway, Daniel's shoulder brushed Marcus's with deliberate force, his sneer daring a reaction. Marcus held his ground, his calm masking the storm brewing inside. He could feel it building to confrontation that would shatter the fragile peace of the precinct. Late one night, as he sat in his office poring over the evidence one final time, his phone buzzed, jolting him from his focus. It was Laura, her message stark and urgent. "We've got him." "But he knows. Be careful." Marcus stared at the screen, his pulse hammering in his ears. This was the tipping point, the spark before the blaze. He couldn't foresee the chaos that awaited, but he knew one thing: justice demanded a price, and he was ready to pay it. The precinct's meeting room was a pressure cooker when the day arrived, the air heavy with anticipation. Officers packed the space, their murmurs buzzing like static as Marcus stood at the head of the table. A projector hummed behind him, casting a faint light across the wall, where documents and grainy video clips glowed, irrefutable proof of Daniel's sins. Painstakingly gathered over weeks, faces turned toward Marcus, a mix of intrigue, doubt, and barely concealed hostility. Among them sat Greg Daniel, lounging with his arms crossed, a smug grin curling his lips as if he were untouchable. Marcus drew a slow, deliberate breath, steadying himself against the weight of what he was about to unleash. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What I'm about to show you isn't easy, but it's necessary, because justice doesn't bend for anyone at even us." The room stilled, every eye fixed on him, and Marcus felt the stakes rise with each heartbeat. This wasn't just a battle against Daniel, it was a stand against a legacy of corruption, a lesson in the cost of unchecked power. Whatever came next, he was ready. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, as Marcus stood at the front, his hands gripping the edges of the projector table. He could feel the eyes of every officer on him, some curious, others skeptical, and a few simmering with barely concealed hostility. Over the past month, he had poured himself into this nights spent hunched over reports, days chasing down leads, his mind racing with the growing realization that what he'd uncovered wasn't just a flaw in the system, but a festering wound. This wasn't easy to present, not because of the evidence itself, but because it forced everyone in the room, including himself, to confront the ugly truth about the badge they wore and the community they'd sworn to shield. Daniels, slouched in his chair near the back, let out a sharp, barking laugh that sliced through the murmurs like a blade. It was loud enough to make heads turn, a deliberate jab meant to unsettle Marcus before he'd even begun. "Oh, this is gonna be rich," Daniels said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's it this time, huh? Another sermon about how we're all the villains in your little story?" His grin was wide, performative, daring Marcus to flinch. But Marcus didn't. He stood straighter, his jaw tight, his dark eyes steady as they swept over the room before settling on Daniels. "This isn't about all of us," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "It's about you." The room went still. The faint buzz of the projector was the only sound, a quiet hum that seemed to amplify the weight of Marcus's words. He pressed a button, and the screen flickered to life. The first image was a report, its text stark against the white background, a complaint filed by a black teenager, barely 16, who'd been stopped on a quiet street corner, patted down, and questioned for no reason other than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The boy's handwriting trembled on the page, a shaky scrawl that betrayed his fear and confusion. Marcus let it linger there, giving the room time to absorb it, before clicking to the next slide. This one was different, an elderly woman, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her words typed out in a formal complaint. She'd called for help after a neighbor's dispute, only to be met with Daniels' sneering insults, his voice barking at her to stop wasting his time. Her grievance had been filed and forgotten, tucked away in some drawer where it gathered dust. Marcus clicked again, and now the screen showed grainy footage from a convenience store camera. The timestamp glowed in the corner as Daniels appeared, his broad frame dominating the frame. He grabbed a young Monelia, Marcus knew his name now, by the collar, slamming him against the wall with a force that made the shelves rattle. The kid's hands flew up, palms open, his voice a panicked stammer lost to the silent video. Each click of the remote was a hammer strike, each image and clip building a portrait of cruelty that no one could ignore. "For 5 years," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly, firm and unyielding, "Daniels has been named in complaint after complaint, reports of harassment, intimidation, abuse of power, dozens of them, and every single time, they were dismissed, buried, or waved off like they didn't matter." He paused, letting the words sink in, his gaze sweeping the room again. "I've talked to the people he's hurt. I've watched hours of body cam footage. I've read his own reports, where he twists the truth to cover his tracks. What I found isn't just mistakes, it's a pattern, a deliberate, calculated misuse of the authority we're supposed to uphold." Daniels shifted in his seat, his smirk fading into something thinner, tighter. He leaned back, crossing his arms, but the casual defiance couldn't hide the flicker of unease in his eyes. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice louder now, meant to rally the room. "You're really gonna drag me through the dirt over a handful of whiners? You know how it is out there, Marcus. People lie. They spin sob stories to make us look like the bad guys. It's part of the job." He forced a laugh, but it came out hollow, lacking the bravado of before. Marcus stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes locking onto Daniel's with a quiet, burning intensity. "These aren't just stories," he said, his voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. "They're facts. Video evidence doesn't lie. Eyewitnesses don't lie when they're willing to stand up and say what they saw. Your own reports contradict the excuses you've been peddling. You've used your badge like a weapon to harass, to humiliate, to exploit the people we're here to protect. That's not the job. That's you." The tension in the room thickened, pressing against the walls, wrapping around every officer like a vice. Marcus clicked the remote one last time, and the screen filled with a still frame from Danielle's own body, moment he'd tried to erase. There he was, towering over Elijah, the same kid from the convenience store footage. In his hand, he dangled a crumpled dollar bill he'd just yanked from Elijah's trembling fingers. A petty theft caught in stark clarity. The room erupted into a low rumble of voice shock, disbelief, a few gasps cutting through the haze. Daniels shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his face flushed a deep, angry red. "You're crossing a line, Marcus," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "You think you can come at me like this? You've got nothing that'll stick." Marcus didn't waver. His calm was unshakable, his voice steady as he replied. "It's already sticking. The footage is verified. Witnesses are ready to testify. And as of this morning, internal affairs is involved." The words landed like a thunderclap. Daniel's bravado faltered, his shoulders slumping for a split second before he caught himself. The color drained from his face, leaving it pale and blotchy. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You think you're some kind of savior? You're just a naive idiot who doesn't get how the world works." Marcus took another step closer, his presence steady, unyielding. "The real world is exactly why I'm doing this," he said, his tone resolute. "People like you think the system's a shield, something to hide behind while you do whatever you want. You think power means you're untouchable, but not anymore. This time, you're answering for it." Daniels opened his mouth to retort, his lips curling into a snarl, but before he could spit out another word, the door swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. Two agents from Internal Affairs stepped inside, their dark suits crisp against the faded beige of the meeting room walls. The woman in front carried herself with quiet authority, her short-cropped hair framing a face that brooked no nonsense. Her partner, a weary man with sharp eyes, stood a step behind, his hand resting lightly on the cuffs at his belt. Their rival sent a ripple through the room, a wave of tension that crashed over Daniels and left him visibly shaken. The woman spoke first, her voice cool and professional, cutting through the chaos. "Greg Daniels, you're under investigation for misconduct, abuse of power, and corruption. We need you to come with us." Daniels froze, his eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for an ally, an exit, anything to claw his way out. "You can't do this," he bellowed, his voice rising to a desperate pitch. "This is a setup. Marcus is out to get me because he's got a grudge, hates me. That's all this is." The agent stepped forward, her movements calm and precise, the handcuffs glinting faintly in her hand. "We have more than enough to move forward," she said evenly. "Please cooperate." For a moment, Daniels looked like he might bolt, his muscles tensed, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. But then his gaze locked with Marcus's, and what burned there wasn't just anger but a raw, seething desperation. "You're gonna regret this," he spat, his voice trembling with venom. "You're gonna wish you'd never crossed me." Marcus didn't flinch, didn't blink. "The only thing I regret," he said quietly, "is not doing this sooner." The room held its breath as the agents closed in. The metallic click of the cuffs snapping around Daniel's wrists echoed like a gunshot, sharp and final. He struggled briefly, his shoulders jerking against the restraint, but the agents were steady, guiding him toward the door with practiced efficiency. The other officers watched in stunned silence, some exchanging uneasy glances, their faces a mix of discomfort and disbelief. Others sat straighter, a quiet relief flickering in their ice justice, at last, cutting through years of complacency. As Daniels was let out, Marcus turned back to the room, his chest tight with the weight of what he'd just done. "This isn't just about one man," he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet urgency. "It's about who we are, what kind of department we want to be. We took an oath to protect and serve, not to prey on the vulnerable. That means holding ourselves accountable, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. If any of you are wondering where the line is between right and wrong, now's the time to figure it out, because the people out there are the ones we swore to stand for. They deserve better than what we've given them." The officers began to file out, their footsteps heavy against the tiled floor, the air still buzzing with unspoken questions. Laura lingered behind, her slight frame dwarfed by the empty chairs around her. She approached Marcus slowly, her brown eyes searching his face. There was admiration there, but also a shadow of worry creasing her brow. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you know this isn't the end of it, right?" Marcus nodded, the exhaustion settling into his bones like damp cold. "It's never over," he said, his gaze drifting to the window. Beyond the glass, the city stretched out, a sprawling maze of lights and lives. But it's a start. For the first time in what felt like forever, a faint spark of hope flickered in his chest, not just for himself, but for Elijah, for the elderly woman, for every soul who'd been crushed under Danielle's boot and told their pain didn't matter. The fight was far from finished, but today, he'd struck a blow against the corruption that had festered too long. As the door clicked shut behind the last of the agents, Marcus stood alone for a moment, his hands braced against the table. The scattered papers and frozen projector screen stared back at him, a testament to the battle he'd just fought and the war still ahead. Laura stayed close, her presence a quiet anchor. "You've shaken things up," she said, her tone carrying a mix of pride and caution. "This isn't just about Daniels anymore. You've turned a light on everything, the excuses, the silence, the way we've let things slide." Marcus exhaled, the weight of her words pressing against him. He knew she was right. The fallout would come, whispers in the locker room, cold shoulders in the halls, maybe worse. But as he looked out at the city, at the people he'd sworn to protect, he felt something shift inside him. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a choice, a stand, a consequence for those who thought power was theirs to abuse. And today, he'd made that choice for Elijah, for the community, for the badge he still believed in. In the dimly lit office, the air hung heavy with tension as Marcus straightened his posture, his dark eyes locking onto Laura's with unwavering resolve. "Some people aren't going to like this," she had warned, her tone laced with caution. He met her gaze squarely, unflinching. "They don't have to like it," he replied, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a man who'd long since made peace with hard truths. "They just have to face it. This department, this badge, it's supposed to mean something. It's supposed to stand for justice. And if that truth makes people squirm, then maybe they've chosen the wrong path in life." His words weren't just a statement, they were a declaration, a line drawn in the sand against a tide of corruption he could no longer ignore. Laura tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile as a flicker of admiration danced in her hazel eyes. She respected his fire, even if she knew it would burn bridges. "You're right," she conceded, her voice softening. "But don't expect everyone to see it through your lens. Daniels might be out of the picture for now, but his roots run deep, tangled in loyalties and fear. There are people here who'll stand by him, not because they think he's innocent, but because admitting the truth means facing their own cowardice." Her words carried a quiet ache, a recognition of the human flaws that too often shielded the guilty. Marcus leaned back against the edge of the cluttered table, arms crossed over his broad chest, the fabric of his sheriff's uniform creasing under the pressure. He exhaled sharply, a sound that spoke of both weariness and defiance. "I'm not blind to that, Laura," he said, his tone firm but tinged with the faintest trace of exhaustion. "I know this fight's going to be messy, uphill every step of the way, but I can't let the threat of pushback silence me. Elijah deserves more than that. This whole community deserves more." His thoughts drifted to his son, his anchor. His reason, and a shadow of frustration darkened his features. Laura hesitated, her boots scuffing softly against the worn wooden floor as she stepped closer, her expression shifting to something gentler, more personal. "Speaking of Elijah," she ventured, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "How's he doing with all this?" The question hung between them, fragile and loaded. Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment, his steady demeanor cracked, revealing the raw edges of a father's guilt and fury. "He's angry," he admitted, his voice low, almost breaking. "Hurt, too, and I can't blame him. He's wrestling with it, trying to piece together why someone with a badge, someone he's been taught to trust, could turn on him like that. I've spent my whole damn career trying to carve out a safer world for him, and now he's wondering if that was all a lie." His fingers clenched into fists, knuckles whitening as the weight of that betrayal settled into his bones. Laura's gaze softened further, her hand hovering briefly as if to reach out before she let it fall. "Kids bounce back, Marcus," she said, her words a quiet bomb. "He'll see what you're doing, how you're standing up, even when it's tearing you apart inside. You're teaching him something powerful, that doing what's right isn't about it being easy. It's about it mattering." Her voice carried a conviction that seemed to steady him. If only for a moment. Marcus drew in a slow, deliberate breath, nodding as he absorbed her words. "I hope you're right," he murmured, his eyes distant. "I just want him to know he doesn't have to swallow this kind of treatment, that he's worth respect, worth dignity, no matter who's wearing the badge." His resolve flickered back to life, a quiet ember stoked into flame. Their exchange was abruptly cut short by a tentative knock at the door. It creaked open, and Carter, a weary young officer with a nervous energy that seemed to vibrate off him, stepped inside. His pale blue eyes darted between Marcus and Laura, uncertainty etched into every line of his boyish face. "Sheriff Evans," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "there's someone here to see you. It's about Daniels." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands fidgeting at his sides as if he wished he could vanish into the floorboards. Marcus frowned, pushing himself off the table with a fluid motion that belied the storm brewing within him. "Who is it?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. Carter swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "It's a woman," he said, almost tripping over the words. "She says she's got information about him, something you'll want to hear." His unease was palpable, as though he sensed the gravity of what was unfolding, but couldn't quite grasp its edges. Marcus exchanged a quick, loaded glance with Laura, a silent agreement passing between them. "Send her in," he said, his voice firm, brooking no hesitation. Carter nodded hastily and disappeared, leaving the room thick with anticipation. Moments later, the door swung open again, and a woman stepped into the cramped office. She was in her late 30s, her frame taut with tension, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides as if holding herself together by sheer will. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, strands escaping to frame a face marked by sleepless nights and unspoken fears. Her eyes, though, burned with a fierce mix of dread and determination, locking onto Marcus as she entered. He gestured toward a chair, his movements calm and deliberate, but she shook her head sharply. "I won't be long," she said, her voice trembling like a taut wire about to snap. "But I need to tell you what Greg Daniels did to my family." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his full attention hers as she began to unravel her story. Her words spilled out in halting bursts, painting a vivid picture of harassment and intimidation, a slow, deliberate dismantling of her life. She spoke of her husband, a local business owner with a quiet pride in his work, targeted by Daniels over fabricated violations that piled up like bricks on their backs. Her voice cracked as she described the suffocating fear that had taken root in their home, the way her husband's good name had been dragged through the mud, and the financial ruin that loomed over them like a storm cloud. "I didn't think anyone would ever stand up to him," she confessed, tears pooling in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "But when I heard what you did, how your Fightinji, knew I had to come here. People like him don't deserve that badge. They don't deserve power over anyone." Marcus felt a surge of anger ignite in his chest, mingling with a steely determination that anchored him. He leaned closer, his voice low but resolute. "Thank you for coming forward," he said, each word measured and heavy with promise. "Your story, it matters. It's going to help us hold him accountable. I swear to you, we're not letting this fade away." The woman nodded, a fragile glimmer of hope piercing through the fear that had shadowed her face. "I just want justice," she whispered, "for my family, for everyone he's crushed under his boot." As she turned to leave, her shoulders squared slightly, as if shedding a fraction of the burden she'd carried through the door. Laura watched her go, then turned to Marcus, her expression a mix of awe and urgency. "That's just the start," she said, her voice rising with a quiet intensity. "If one person's brave enough to speak, others will follow. Daniel's built his empire on sand, and it's starting to crumble." Marcus nodded, his face set in a grim mask of determination. "Then we make sure it collapses completely," he replied, his words a vow etched in stone. The days that followed swirled into a tempest of activity. The office buzzed with a restless energy as reports poured in at just from citizens worn down by Danielle's tyranny, but from within the department itself. Officers who'd once held their tongues, bound by fear or misplaced loyalty, began to step into the light. Their stories wove a tapestry of misconduct, coercion, favoritism, a system bent to serve one man's ego. Marcus spent sleepless nights poring over the evidence, his desk a chaos of papers and coffee cups, each new detail stoking the fire in his gut. Yet with every step forward, the resistance grew. Louder whispers of retaliation slithered through the halls. Rumors of a counterattack meant to paint Marcus as the villain in his own crusade. One gray afternoon, as Marcus sat hunched over a report detailing Danielle's most blatant abuses, Laura burst through the door, her face drained of color. "You need to see this," she said, thrusting a printed email into his hands. He scanned the page, his jaw clenching tighter with every line. The accusations were vicious claims that he'd doctored evidence, that this entire investigation was a personal vendetta dressed up as justice. "They're flipping the script," he growled, his voice a low rumble of frustration. "They're shielding him by making me the target." Laura's hand found his shoulder, her grip firm. "Don't let them rattle you," she urged. "The evidence is solid, and the people who count thee know what's real. The community's behind you. Daniels can't bury the truth forever." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening like steel in a forge. "Then we keep going," he said, his voice a quiet thunder. "We don't stop until he's answering for every damn thing he's done." That night, the world outside his kitchen window was cloaked in shadow, the faint hum of crickets punctuating the silence. Marcus sat at the table, files spread before him like a battlefield, his brow furrowed in concentration. A soft shuffle of footsteps broke his focus, and he looked up to see Elijah hovering in the doorway. The boy's face was a storm of uncertainty, his dark eyes so much like his father searching for something solid to hold onto. "Dad," his voice was small, tentative, but it carried a weight that made Marcus set his work aside and turn fully to him. "You okay, son?" Marcus asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he gestured to the chair beside him. Elijah hesitated, then crossed the room and sank into the seat, his hands restless in his lap. "Is it about that cop?" he asked, his gaze fixed on his father. "The one who took my money?" Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, it is. We're getting closer, but it's not finished yet." Elijah studied him for a long moment, his young face etched with questions he didn't know how to ask. Then, quietly, he said, "Do you think he'll get what he deserves?" Marcus's heart clenched, but his voice remained steady. "I do," he said, meeting his son's eyes with unwavering certainty. "It might take time, and it won't be simple, but justice has a way of finding people like him. It always does." Elijah nodded slowly, a spark of hope igniting in his gaze. "I'm glad you're my dad," he murmured, almost too soft to hear. "I'm glad you're fighting." And in that moment, Marcus knew that every sleepless night, every battle ahead, was worth it for his son, for the truth, and for the hard-earned lesson that power unchecked would always meet its reckoning. Marcus sat across from his son, Elijah, the dim light of the living room casting soft shadows over their faces. His throat tightened as a swell of emotion rose within him, a mix of pride, fear, and an unshakable resolve. He forced a smile, though it trembled at the edges, and reached out to rest a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "I'm doing this for you," he said, his voice low but steady. "For you, and for every single person out there who deserves more than what this world has given them." Elijah looked up, his young eyes wide with a flicker of hope, and for a fleeting moment, the crushing burden of the battle ahead seemed to lift. Marcus felt it to a spark reigniting deep in his chest. This wasn't just about righting a wrong anymore. It was about carving out a future where his son, and every child like him, could walk through life unburdened by fear. No matter how steep the cost, Marcus vowed silently to himself, he would see that future come to life. The precinct the next day was a shadow of its usual self. Where once there had been the steady buzz of ringing phones, clattering keyboards, and barked orders, now there hung a stillness so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Marcus strode through the hallways, his boots echoing against the polished floor, and he could feel the weight of every glance that darted his way. Conversations hushed as he approached, officers turning their heads or busying themselves with papers that didn't need reading. The tension was palpable, a storm brewing just beneath the surface, and Marcus knew exactly why. Daniels, a man who had wielded his badge like a weapon, had been hauled into custody the day before, and the ripples of that act were still spreading. Laura had warned him this would happen push against someone with power, and the system would push back twice as hard. But Marcus had braced himself for it, steeling his heart against the inevitable fallout. Justice, he reminded himself, was never a straight path. The first blow came swiftly, delivered in the form of a crisp, official complaint slapped onto his desk by Laura later that morning. She stood there, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line of barely contained frustration, their hitting below the belt. She said, her voice a quiet growl, "Wallace is behind this, Sergeant Brent Wallace. He's saying you botched the investigation, that you had it out for Daniels from the start and twisted the evidence to fit your grudge." Marcus picked up the document, his fingers brushing the paper as his eyes scanned the accusations. Each word was a jab, sharp and calculated claims of bias, coercion, evidence tampering. His jaw clenched, a slow burn of anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Brent Wallace wasn't just any officer. He was a veteran, a man with decades on the force, his broad shoulders and steely gaze commanding respect. But that respect came with a catch. Wallace's loyalty was a fortress, built not around the law but around the men he'd served with, right or wrong. To him, Marcus wasn't a crusader, he was a traitor. "It's what I saw coming," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, his tone even despite the fire in his gut. "They're scared. They'll drag my name through the mud to shield themselves, but it won't stick. They can't bury the truth." Laura's eyes locked onto his, her stance unwavering. "So what's our move? This isn't just about Daniels anymore. Wallace and his crew, if they win this, everything you've fought for goes down with it." Marcus let the question hang in the air, his mind already spinning through a dozen paths forward. "The evidence is our anchor," he said finally. "Wallace can scream all he wants, but the facts don't bend. We keep the spotlight on Danielson, what he's done, on the lives he's crushed. If we let them rewrite the story, we're finished." Laura nodded, a fierce glint in her eye matching his own. "Then we don't let them. I'll make sure every shred of what we've uncovered stays front and center. Daniels doesn't get to fade into the shadowsnet on our watch." The days that followed were a tempest of chaos and conviction. News of Daniels' arrest broke like a dam, flooding the airwaves and sparking a wildfire of outrage. Reporters swarmed the precinct, their cameras flashing like lightning, while protesters gathered outside, their voices rising in a chorus of fury. Signs bobbed above the crowd: "Justice now, no more corruption," and the air crackled with a raw, electric demand for change. Marcus found himself thrust into the eye of it all, fielding questions from journalists with microphones thrust in his face, meeting with community leaders whose eyes burned with both hope and suspicion. One evening, he stood before a packed room at a town hall, the wooden floor creaking under the weight of the crowd. The air was thick with sweat and anticipation, every face turned toward him, waiting. He took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of their stares press against his chest, and spoke. "I know you're angry," he began, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "You've got every damn right to be. What happened to what's happened to so many of you, it's a disgrace. And I won't stand here pretending otherwise. But I'm telling you this, we're not stopping at words. This department will change. We'll root out the rot, hold ourselves to account, and rebuild what's been broken. And we're not doing it alone. I want you with us. Your voices, your stories, they're the compass we'll follow." A man near the back shot to his feet, his weathered face etched with years of disappointment. "Talk's cheap," he shouted, his voice rough with distrust. "We've heard this before, promises that turn to dust. Why should we believe you?" Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "Because this time, we're not just promising. Daniels is the start, not the end. We're tearing this place apart, every rule, every habit that lets men like him thrive. And I need you to help me do it. This isn't my fight alone, it's ours." The room stilled, the weight of his words sinking in. Then a woman in the front row stood, her hands trembling but her voice resolute. "We've been waiting for someone to say that," she said, tears glinting in her eyes. "Don't let us down." Marcus held her stare, his own voice firm with a promise he'd die to keep. "I won't. We won't." The meeting dissolved into a mix of cautious hope and lingering doubt, voices overlapping as people spilled into the night. As Marcus headed to his car, a young woman stepped into his path, her college sweatshirt wrinkled and her eyes bright with a nervous energy. "Sheriff Evans," she said, hesitating, "I'm Maya. I'm studying criminal justice, and thank you. It means everything to see someone like you actually listening." Marcus offered a tired smile, his bones aching but his spirit unbowed. "Thank you, Maya. It's people like you who keep me pushing. Don't ever stop speaking. Your voice is stronger than you know." Weeks rolled by, and the case against Daniels grew darker with every new witness who stepped forward. Their stories wove a tapestry of abuse, intimidation, bribery, violential enabled by a system that had turned a blind eye. The pressure on the department mounted, a tidal wave of scrutiny crashing down, and Marcus stood at its forefront, exhilarated and exhausted in equal measure. But the pushback didn't relent. Wallace and his allies dug in, their efforts to discredit Marcus growing more frantic. One night, an anonymous note slipped under his office door, a scrawled warning about a secret meeting of Daniels's loyalists, plotting to rally the precinct against him and kill the investigation. Marcus's pulse quickened as he read it, the paper crinkling in his grip. Confronting them was a gamble, but letting it fester wasn't an option. With Laura at his side, her jaw set and her eyes blazing, he made his choice. They walked into the dimly lit back room of the precinct where the meeting was unfolding, the air thick with cigarette smoke and muttered curses. A dozen officers sat around a scratch table, their faces hardening as Marcus stepped into view. Wallace was at the head, his broad frame hunched forward, his voice mid-sentence when it cut off abruptly. The silence was deafening. Every eye locked on Marcus, but he didn't flinch. He stood tall, his presence a quiet storm of authority, and in that moment, the lesson was clear. Power could corrupt, but justice, when fought for with unwavering heart, could cut deeper still. The consequences of Daniels's Regnand Wallace's blind loyalty would echo far beyond that room, a reckoning no one could escape. The air in the precinct felt heavy as Marcus stepped through the doorway, his boots echoing faintly against the polished floor. The officers scattered across the room froze, their faces a swirling storm of shock, defiance, and something unspoken, perhaps fear. He could feel their eyes boring into him, sharp as knives, but his own gaze remained steady, unyielding. "I hear you've got something to say," he started, his voice low and even, carrying the weight of a man who'd already weathered too many battles. "So let's hear it. Lay it all out." From the cluster of uniforms, a hulking figure emerged. Carter, a broad-shouldered officer with a jaw set like concrete, and eyes that glinted with barely restrained anger. He took a step forward, his presence filling the space like a thundercloud rolling in. "You've got some guts showing up here, Evans," Carter growled, his voice rough and jagged. "You think you can waltz in, rip this department to shreds, and walk out without a scratch? You're tearing down everything we've built." His words dripped with venom, his fists clenched at his sides as if itching to swing. Marcus didn't flinch. He stood rooted, his dark eyes locking onto Carter's with a quiet intensity that seemed to unnerve the bigger man. "This department isn't crumbling," he replied, his tone measured but edged with steel. "It's being remade. If you think holding people to account is the same as destruction, then maybe you're part of what's rotten here." His words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the tension like a blade. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the silence so thick it pressed against their chests. Carter's face twitched, a flicker of doubt breaking through his bravado, but he said nothing. his glare burning hotter. The standoff crackled with unspoken threats, the kind that could erupt into chaos with a single spark. But then, from the shadowed back of the room, a voice cut through the stillness, soft but steady, tinged with a tremble of nerves. It was Riley, a young officer barely out of the academy, his uniform still crisp, his face boyish yet marked by a quiet resolve. "He's right," Riley said, stepping into the faint light, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "We can't keep pretending. What Daniels did, it was wrong, disgusting, even. And if we don't stand up for what's decent, what's the point of wearing this badge?" His words wavered slightly, betraying his uncertainty, but they carried a raw honesty that silenced the room. The weight of Riley's confession settled over them like a fog, heavy and inescapable. Eyes darted between faces, some hardened with resistance, others softening with reluctant agreement. Slowly, one by one, other voices joined in, tentative at first, then bolder. "He's got a point," muttered an older officer, his grizzled beard hiding a grimace. "We've let too much slide," added another, her voice tight with shame. The tide was shifting, a fragile ripple of change stirring beneath the surface. Wallace, a stern figure with a face carved from stone, stood apart, his silence louder than any protest. Marcus caught the glint in his eyes, dark, unreadable, but cracked with the first signs of doubt. As Marcus left the precinct that night, the cool air brushed against his skin, carrying away some of the day's weight. He felt a cautious flicker of hope ignite within him. Fragile but persistent, the fight was far from one. Years of corruption wouldn't unravel in a single meeting. But for the first time, he glimpsed a horizon where justice might stand a chance. The path ahead stretched long and treacherous, lined with obstacles he couldn't yet see. But Marcus was no stranger to struggle. He'd made a vow to Elijah, to the community he'd grown up in, to the mirror he faced each morning, and he'd see it through, no matter how deep the cost cut. Days later, the precinct's atmosphere had transformed subtly. The silence that once buzzed with tension now hummed with questions, a restless undercurrent of unease and possibility. Marcus sensed it in the way officers avoided his gaze or lingered near him, their whispers trailing off as he passed. Change wasn't a switch to flip, it was a slow, grinding process, met with skepticism born from decades of apathy. Yet there were signs of progress, a quiet nod from a veteran cop in the hall, a murmured confession of doubt from another over coffee. Small victories, but they fueled him. One afternoon, as Marcus sat hunched over a desk littered with files, a sharp knock jolted him from his thoughts. The door creaked open, and Laura stepped in, her auburn hair catching the dim light. Her expression danced between wariness and a spark of optimism. A stack of papers clutched tightly in her hands. She dropped them onto his desk with a soft thud and slid into the chair across from him, her movements brisk and unceremonious. "I've been digging through the testimonies," she said, leaning back with a sigh that carried the weight of what she'd uncovered. "It's worse than we thought. Daniels wasn't just crooked, he was a predator, Marcus, and everyone who looked the other way. They're just as guilty." Marcus reached for the papers, his fingers brushing the edges as he flipped through them. Each page was a gut punch, stories of coercion, abuse, lives shattered under the shield of authority. His jaw tightened, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "This isn't just about Daniels anymore," he said, his voice low but resolute. "It's about a whole system that let him thrive. If we don't rip that out at the root, it'll just grow back uglier." He set the stack down, his hand resting on it as if to steady himself against the anger rising in his chest. Laura watched him, her green eyes piercing and unwavering. "You're right," she said, her tone softening slightly, "but you're carrying this like it's all on you. It's too big for one person, Marcus. There are others who see what you see, let them carry some of it." Her words were gentle but firm, a nudge toward a truth he'd been dodging. He leaned back, his fingers drumming absently on the desk as he wrestled with her advice. "I know you're right," he admitted, his voice quieter now, laced with a vulnerability he rarely let slip. "But it's personal, Laura. Every time I see Elijah's eyes, that kid's quiet strength, think about what he endured, what so many in this community have endured. It's hard not to feel like I owe them this." His gaze drifted to the window, where the city sprawled beyond, its lights flickering like distant promises. Laura leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're doing everything you can, Marcus, more than most would. But you're still just one man. If this is going to work, if it's going to last, it has to grow beyond you. The community's ready to fight with you. Let them." Her words sank into him, heavy with truth, and he nodded slowly, a spark of resolve flaring anew in his chest. "You're right," he said, meeting her gaze. "This isn't my fight alone. It's ours." That evening, Marcus found himself in the gymnasium of a local high school, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and the buzz of a restless crowd. The turnout stunned. Himrows of folding chairs overflowed with people from every corner of the community, parents clutching photos of lost children, teenagers with wary eyes, elders whose faces bore the lines of too many broken promises. The energy crackled, a potent mix of fury, hope, and a hunger for something better. As Marcus stepped onto the makeshift stage, the room hushed, all eyes turning to him. He stood tall, his presence steadying the chaos, and began to speak. "I know why you're here," he said, his voice ringing clear over the murmur of the crowd. "You're tired of being invisible, tired of being stepped on, tired of the people meant to protect you turning into the ones you fear. I feel that exhaustion in my bones, too. But I'm here with you. And if we're going to turn this around, we've got to do it side by side." He laid out his vision: open investigations, oversight from the people, training to strip away bias and force accountability. Nods rippled through the crowd, though whispers of doubt lingered. A man rose from the sea of faces, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he gripped the back of a chair. "We've heard pretty words before," he called out, his voice sharp but not cruel. "How do we know this isn't just more smoke? Another promise that fades when the spotlight's off?" The question hung there, raw and real, and Marcus met the man's gaze without hesitation. "Because this isn't about promises," Marcus replied, his voice steady as granite. "It's about action. I'm not asking you to trust me blind, I'm asking you to demand I deliver, to hold me and everyone in that precinct to the fire. Change doesn't come from speeches, it comes from you refusing to let it die." The gymnasium erupted, applause thundering off the walls, a wave of sound that shook the rafters. The night stretched on, voices rising with stories of pain and defiance, and Marcus listened, his notepad filling with names and details, his heart swelling with purpose. But the dawn brought shadows. Word reached him the next day Wallace and a tight knot of loyalists were sharpening their knives, drafting a grievance to paint him as the villain, a disruptor poisoning their ranks. The news landed like a blow, but Marcus straightened, his resolve hardening. Justice was never cheap, and power didn't yield without a fight. The lesson burned clear: unchecked authority bred monsters, and only a relentless stand could tear it down. He was ready. They all were. The news didn't jolt Marcus out of his chair, but it settled over him like a dense fog, thickening the already tangled mess he'd been wading through for weeks. He sat behind his desk, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds, casting jagged shadows across the clutter of papers and coffee cups. His office smelled faintly of ink and exhaustion, a space that had become both a sanctuary and a battlefield. When Laura stormed in, the door banging against the wall, her presence sliced through the stillness like a blade. Her face was a storm of emotion, anger blazing in her narrowed eyes, concern tugging at the tight line of her mouth. "They're going all out now," she said, her voice sharp as she began pacing the room, her boots thudding against the worn carpet. "Wallace is out there stirring the pot, trying to turn everyone against you. He's saying you're the one tearing this department apart." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His expression remained steady, almost carved from stone, but beneath it, a deep weariness pulsed. He ran a hand over his jaw, feeling the stubble that had grown unchecked amid the chaos. "Let him try," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying the quiet strength of a man who'd seen too much to flinch. "The truth's on our side. Laura, if Wallace wants to dig his own grave and show the world he's part of the rot, that's his call." Laura stopped mid-step, planting her hands on her hips, her stance wide and defiant. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, but a few strands had escaped, framing her face like tendrils of frustration. "You're not worried?" she pressed, her tone rising with disbelief. This could turn into a real mess, Marcus, and fast. He met her gaze, his dark eyes unyielding yet softened by a flicker of resolve. "It's already a mess," he replied, each word deliberate. "But if we fold now, they've won, and I'm not about to let that happen." As the grievance against Officer Daniels churned forward, Marcus braced himself for the storm he knew was coming. He spent long hours hunched over legal documents, the text blurring under the harsh glow of his desk lamp, consulting with his legal team, sharp-minded folks in crisp suits who spoke in clipped, confident tones. He pored over department policies, tracing the fine print with a pen, determined to root out every loophole that had shielded Daniel's actions. Transparency wasn't just a buzzword for him, it was a lifeline, a promise he'd made to himself and the people counting on him. Outside his office, the community's support swelled like a rising tide. Letters of encouragement arrived in stacks, penned in shaky handwriting or typed with fervent gratitude, while local leaders took to podiums and microphones, their voices booming with solidarity. But inside the precinct, the air was thick with hostility, a constant reminder of the steep hill he was climbing. Every sidelong glance, every muttered remark from his colleagues, felt like a brick added to the weight on his shoulders. One quiet afternoon, as Marcus sat sifting through yet another pile of reports, the door creaked open. Elijah stood there, his slight frame silhouetted against the hallway's dim light. The boy hesitated, his sneakers scuffing the floor, his expression a tangle of uncertainty and something deeper, worry, perhaps, or a need to understand. "Hey, Dad," he said softly, his voice barely cutting through the hum of the radiator. Marcus looked up, and for a moment, the hardness in his face melted into a faint, tender smile. "I'm fine, son," he said, setting his pen down. "Just busy." Elijah shuffled forward and sank into the chair across from him, his hands fidgeting with the frayed edge of his hoodie. His eyes, wide and searching, darted to the papers on the desk before settling on his father. "Is it about the cop?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The one who you know." Marcus nodded, pushing the documents aside with a slow, deliberate motion. "Yeah, it is. There's a lot happening, but we're getting somewhere." Elijah chewed his lip, his fingers twisting the fabric tighter. After a long pause, he spoke again, his words fragile, almost lost in the stillness. "Do you think it's worth it, all this trouble, just for one guy?" Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his gaze locking onto his son's. There was a fire in his eyes now, tempered by a quiet, unshakable conviction. "It's not just about one guy, Elijah," he said, his voice steady but rich with emotion. "It's about making sure what happened to Yautho's moments of fear, that disrespect doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about proving that people matter, that their voices deserve to be heard. It's tough, and yeah, it's messy, but it's worth it. You're worth it." Elijah's eyes glistened, a shimmer of unshed tears catching the light, and he gave a small, slow nod. "Thanks, Dad," he murmured, his voice thick, "for everything." Weeks bled into one another, and the case against Daniels unfurled like a dark tapestry, revealing not just his personal misdeeds, but a sprawling web of systemic rot that had festered far too long. The department squirmed under the glare of public scrutiny, and Marcus found himself thrust into the heart of a burgeoning movement for change. The community's momentum was a roaring force now, undeniable and fierce, yet within the precinct, resistance hardened like concrete. Still, for the first time, Marcus glimpsed a faint spark of hope, a possibility that justice might prevail, even if the price was steep. Each day tightened the screws, the stakes climbing higher, the tension coiling tighter. He knew the battle was far from won, but he was ready to fight it to the bitter end for Elijah, for the people outside those walls, for the simple, stubborn belief that right should triumph over wrong. The pressure didn't relent, it grew heavier, a relentless weight pressing down on Marcus with every sunrise. What had begun as a mission to hold one rogue cop accountable had mushroomed into something far grander, a reckoning that threatened to upend the entire department. To some, it was a chance to purge decades of decay. To others, it was a personal affront, a torch waved close to their carefully guarded world. Marcus felt the rift widening daily, a chasm splitting loyalties and laying bare the fault lines of power. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his office, The glow of his lamp painting the walls in warm amber, the precinct beyond his door was hushed. Only the faint shuffle of boots from the night shift and the distant murmur of voices broke the silence. A sharp knock jolted him from his thoughts, and Laura stepped in, her face etched with fatigue, but her eyes blazing with purpose. She carried a thick folder, its edges worn, and dropped it onto his desk with a thud that echoed in the quiet. "What's this now?" Marcus asked, his voice rough with exhaustion but laced with curiosity. Laura sank into the chair opposite him, leaning forward, her elbows braced on her knees. "More testimonies," she said, her tone clipped but urgent. "This one's from a retired officer. He's saying Daniels didn't act alone, had backup, people who covered for him. Looked the other way when things got ugly. If this holds up, it could drag some of the big shots into the fire." Marcus flipped open the folder, his brow creasing as he scanned the pages. Each statement was a brushstroke in a grim portrait of culture that hadn't just ignored Daniel's abuses, but propped them up, shielding him with a wink and a nod. It wasn't one bad apple, it was a poisoned orchard. "This just keeps growing," he muttered, frustration threading through his words. "Every time I think we've hit rock bottom, there's another layer of filth." Laura nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. "That's how it goes, Marcus. You dig deep enough, and the ugliness spills out. But this is what we're here for, to face it, no matter how nasty it gets." He leaned back, dragging a hand over his face, feeling the strain of weeks etched into his skin. "I keep thinking about Elijah," he said, his voice softening, growing distant. "How this all started because of what that bastard did to him. And now it's this monster of a thing. I know it's right, Laura, but sometimes it feels like I'm drowning in it." Her gaze softened, a rare crack in her armor. "You're not in this alone," she said firmly, her words a lifeline tossed into the dark. "You've got me, the community, even some of the guys here who are starting to see the light. Don't lose sight of that." He nodded, letting her reassurance settle over him, a fleeting comfort against the storm. "Thanks, Laura," he said quietly. "That keeps me going." As she left, Marcus turned back to the folder, each page a shard of a shattered system. The implications loomed large. Accountability wasn't just about Daniels anymore. It was about tearing down a fortress of silence, brick by brick. Justice demanded it, but the cost would be steep, and the backlash would roar louder with every step. The next morning, as he walked into the precinct, the air crackled with tension. Eyes followed him, some wary, some venomous, while whispers slithered through the halls like snakes. The discontent wasn't new, but today it bore a sharper edge, a weight that pressed against his chest as he moved. He'd chosen this path, knowing it would expose the festering wounds of power abused, knowing it would test the limits of courage and consequence. And yet, with every hostile stare, every murmured threat, he felt the lesson solidify. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed, it was a fire forged, and he would wield it, no matter who it burned. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy gray clouds hanging over the precinct. As Sheriff Marcus strode purposefully toward his office, his boots echoed on the worn linoleum floor, a steady rhythm that betrayed none of the storm brewing within him. Before he could reach the door, Sergeant Wallace intercepted him, his bulky frame leaning casually against the doorway. A smug grin stretched across Wallace's weathered face, his eyes glinting with a mix of mockery and challenge. "Morning, Sheriff," he drawled, his voice thick with condescension, like syrup dripping over jagged rocks. "Heard you've been real busy lately, huh? Digging up dirt on everyone like some kind of bloodhound. Must be wearing you out, keeping that halo polished." Marcus didn't falter, his jaw tightened, but his steps didn't slow as he brushed past Wallace, the faint scent of stale coffee and cigarette smoke trailing the sergeant like a shadow. He had no time for petty taunts, not today, not ever. But Wallace wasn't the type to let silence win. With a deliberate shuffle of his boots, he followed Marcus into the office, shutting the door with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. Crossing his arms over his broad chest, he planted himself like a wall, his smirk twisting into something sharper. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" he sneered, his tone biting now, venom seeping through every syllable. "Taking down Daniels, exposing all this so-called corruption. But let me tell you something, Marcus, you're not saving the day. You're just pissing people off, stacking enemies like firewood for the winter." Marcus turned slowly, his movements measured, deliberate. His face was a mask of calm, but beneath it, a fire simmered steady, unyielding. He met Wallace's gaze, his dark eyes piercing through the sergeant's bravado. "If doing what's right means I've got enemies, then I'll live with that," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm not here to win a popularity contest, Wallace. I'm here to uphold the lawsome thing you might have forgotten the meaning of. If that bothers you, maybe it's time you ask yourself why you're still wearing that badge." For a fleeting second, Wallace's smirk wavered, a crack in his armor, his lips twitched, and a flicker of anger sparked in his eyes, hot and raw. "You're tearing this place apart," he shot back, his voice rising, rough edged with frustration. "People don't trust us anymore because of you. You're dragging us all through the mud and you give a damn about that." His fists clenched at his sides, the knuckles whitening as if he could physically wrestle Marcus's resolve into submission. Marcus stepped closer, closing the distance between them until the air seemed to hum with the weight of their confrontation. His voice remained steady, but there was steel in it now, tempered by years of battles fought in silence. "People don't trust us because of what Daniels did with people like him got away with for too long. Not because I'm holding them accountable. You want to point fingers. Look at him. Look at yourself for pretending it didn't happen. But don't you dare pin this on me for doing what's necessary." His words hung there heavy, unmovable, a truth neither of them could escape. The room fell silent, the kind of quiet that crackles with unspoken fury. Wallace's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the stubble as he wrestled with a retort that never came. His eyes burned, but his bravado had no fuel left to burn. Without another word, he spun on his heel, yanking the door open and slamming it shut behind him. The bang reverberated through the office, rattling the framed certificates on the wall. Marcus stood still, letting out a slow, shuddering breath. His heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins like a river breaking its banks. Every clash like this chipped away at him, a relentless erosion of his spirit. But surrender wasn't an option when so much was at stake. As the day dragged on, the weight of his mission pressed harder against his shoulders. Late in the afternoon, his desk phone buzzed, the shrill ring cutting through his focus. It was Internal Affairs. Their voices were clipped, professional, but beneath the formality, Marcus caught a thread of grim determination. They'd sifted through the latest pile of evidence testimonies, documents, whispered confessions, and the net was widening. More officers were now implicated, their names tangled in the web Daniels had spun. It was progress, a fragile step toward justice, but it also meant the war was far from won. Marcus hung up the phone, staring at the cracked plaster on the wall, his mind racing. Each victory came with a cost, and he wondered how much more he could bear before the cracks spread to him. That evening, he trudged home, the sky now bruised with twilight. The house was quiet, save for the soft creak of the floorboards as he stepped into the living room. There, on the sagging couch, sat Elijah, his teenage son, a book propped open on his lap. The boy's dark hair fell over his eyes as he flipped a page, but the moment Marcus entered, he looked up, his movements tentative, almost fragile. "Hey, Dad," Elijah said, his voice softer than usual, a whisper against the stillness. "How was work?" Marcus eased himself onto the couch beside him, the cushions sighing under his weight. Exhaustion clung to him like damp clothes, but he forced a faint smile. "Long day," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face, "but we're getting somewhere, slowly." Elijah hesitated, his fingers tightening around the book's edges. His eyes wide, searching at Marcus's, and the question spilled out, raw and unguarded. "Are you ever scared, like, really scared that something bad's gonna happen because of all this?" The words hit Marcus like a punch, stealing the air from his lungs. He looked at Elijah, his son's face a mirror of innocence and fear, and his heart ached. Reaching out, he rested a hand on Elijah's shoulder, the warmth of the touch grounding them both. "I won't lie to you, Elijah," he said, his voice softening, thick with emotion. "There are days when it's heavy when I wonder if I'm on the right path, if I'm strong enough to keep going. But then I think about you, about the kind of world I want you to live in, Oni, where people don't have to be afraid to speak up. And that's what keeps me moving forward, no matter how hard it gets." Elijah nodded, slow and deliberate, his eyes shimmering with a blend of pride and worry. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he said quietly, the words trembling with sincerity. "I know it's not easy, but you're doing something that matters." Marcus's throat tightened, a lump rising as he fought to keep his composure. He managed a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, son. That means everything to me, more than you'll ever know." Later that night, Marcus retreated to his study, the dim glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Papers littered the desk reports, notes, timelines of Danielle's crimes. The road ahead stretched out like a dark, winding path, full of uncertainty and looming threats. But as he sat there, pen in hand, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. This was for Elijah, for the community he'd sworn to protect, for the fragile hope that justice could still mean something. Whatever came next, anger, betrayal, or worse, he'd face it head on. Weeks later, the courtroom was a sea of held breaths and hushed murmurs. Greg Daniels stood at the defendant's table, his once arrogant posture now stiff, brittle, like a statue on the verge of crumbling. The trial had peeled back every layer of his deceitibus of power, misconduct, corruption, each charge a hammer strike against the facade he'd built. When the judge's voice rang out, steady and final, guilty on all counts, the room seemed to exhale as one. The crowd stirred, a ripple of relief and triumph washing over them. For the victims who dared to speak, it was a balm on old wounds. For the community, it was a beacon, a promise that justice could still burn bright. And for Marcus, standing in the back, it was the end of a chapter he'd never wanted to write but couldn't abandon. Daniels turned as the bailiff cuffed him, his eyes locking onto Marcus. There was no remorse there, only a cold, bewildered fury, as if he still couldn't fathom how his empire of influence had collapsed. Marcus held his gaze, unflinching, but felt no thrill in the man's ruin. All he felt was a quiet, bone-deep relief that the system, flawed as it was, had held firm this time. He glanced toward the gallery, where Elijah sat beside Angela, his longtime friend and confidant. The boy's face glowed with awe, a silent testament to the weight of what Marcus had achieved. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the chaos of the world faded. This wasn't just about a verdict, it was about proving to Elijah, to everyone, that power couldn't silence truth forever. In the weeks that followed, the precinct transformed, reshaped by the fallout of Danielle's disgrace. Officers who'd shielded him were quietly stripped of their badges, their exits swift and unceremonious. Others, unwilling to bend to the new rules Marcus enforced, opted for early retirement. Their desks left empty like ghosts of a tainted past. Training programs were torn down and rebuilt, hours spent on de-escalation, community trust, and rooting out bias. Marcus threw himself into the work, meeting with local leaders in cramped church basements and bustling diners, their voices sharp with pain and hope. He listened, really listened, weaving their words into the reforms. It was grueling, relentless, but for the first time in years, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet, a real, tangible change. Wallace, once Danielle's loudest defender, couldn't escape the reckoning. An internal review uncovered years of buried complaints he'd swept under the rug. His resignation a bitter inevitability. His departure was a thunderclap, a warning to the rest of the force. Corruption had no sanctuary here anymore. Laura, Marcus's steadfast deputy, stepped up beside him, her calm strength a lifeline in the storm. With her keen mind and unshakable loyalty, she bridged the widening gap between the precinct and the people. Her presence a quiet force that steadied them all. Marcus leaned on her more than he'd ever admit, knowing this fight would have broken him without her. Even Elijah seemed to grow in the aftermath, his quiet pride blooming into something fiercer. He'd linger in the kitchen late at night, asking Marcus about the case, his questions sharp and thoughtful. The boy was becoming a man, shaped by the lessons of justice and the cost of power abused. And Marcus, watching him, knew the truest victory wasn't in the courtroom, it was in the legacy he'd leave behind. A world where right could still prevail, no matter how steep the climb. The air hung heavy with the golden hues of late afternoon as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across Greenwood Park. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, mingling with the rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. For Marcus, This was a moment of quiet triumph, a chance to sit on his weathered porch with his son, Elijah, and watch the world settle into dusk. The boyno, the young man beside him, was no longer just the bright, inquisitive child he'd raised. There was a fire in Elijah now, a steady glow of purpose that had taken root after everything they'd endured. Marcus felt it in his bones. Pride, yes, but something deeper, to a quiet awe at the person his son was becoming. Elijah shifted in his chair, his dark eyes tracing the horizon where the last slivers of sunlight bled into the sky. He'd always been thoughtful, but tonight his silence carried weight, a question brewing beneath the surface. Finally, he turned to his father, his voice soft yet threaded with a tremor of doubt. "Dad, do you think things are really going to change? I mean, really change?" The words lingered between them, fragile but insistent, like a pebble dropped into still water. Marcus didn't answer right away. He leaned back, the creak of the wooden chair filling the pause as he let his gaze drift across the fading light. Memories flickered in his mind, years of struggle, of standing against a system that bent too easily under the weight of power. He saw Daniel's face, the man whose corruption had once cast a shadow over their city, a shadow that had nearly swallowed them whole. And he saw himself, battered but unbowed, fighting not just for survival, but for something greater. "Change," he said at last, his voice low and measured, "isn't a gift handed to us, Elijah. It's not a sunrise that comes whether we will it or not. It's a battly slow, stubborn thing we claw out of the earth day after day. But I believe in the fight. And more than that, I believe in you." Elijah's lips curved into a smile, tentative at first, then blooming with a quiet resolve that seemed to light up the dimming porch. It was the kind of smile that carried dreams, the kind that refused to bow to despair. "I'm glad you didn't give up, Dad," he said, his tone warm with admiration. "You showed me what it means to stand tall, even when everything's pushing you down." Marcus reached out, his calloused hand resting on his son's shoulder, and in that touch, he felt the swell of his heart. Pride, yes, but also gratitude. "And you," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "you showed me why it's worth standing at all." Across the city, time had begun to weave its slow, imperfect healing. The wounds left by Daniel's reign of arrogance and abuse weren't gone. Scars ran deep, etched into the streets and the souls of the people who walked them. But they'd become something else too, a testament, a reminder of what resilience could achieve. The police department, once a looming specter of distrust, was shifting. Officers like Blake and Carterman, who'd once wielded their badges like weapons, were being weeded out, their actions exposed by those brave enough to speak. It wasn't a perfect transformation, progress rarely is, but for Marcus, who'd spent years staring down the barrel of that corruption, it was a beginning. And beginnings, he knew, were enough to build on. Far from the porch where Marcus and Elijah sat, another story had unfolded on that would ripple through the city and beyond. It began in the same park Marcus had once walked with his son, a place of sprawling oaks and winding paths where the ordinary hum of life played out. That afternoon, the park had been alive with its usual rhythm, joggers weaving through the trails, kids chasing each other near the pond, and an elderly woman named Esther perched on a stone bench, her gray hair catching the light as she fed crumbs to the pigeons at her feet. She was a fixture here, her colorful shawl a familiar sight to regulars, her soft smile a quiet comfort to anyone who paused to notice. At 78, Esther carried the weight of a life well lived, decades of raising children, tending to a community, and finding peace in small joys like this. She never imagined that peace would shatter so suddenly. The trouble came without warning. Two officers, Blake and Carter, strode toward her with the kind of swagger that reeked of unchecked power. Their voices cut through the air, sharp and accusing, claiming she'd violated some vague ordinance they couldn't even name. Esther blinked up at them, confusion creasing her weathered face. "I'm just sitting here," she said, her tone gentle but firm, the way she'd once soothed her grandchildren through tantrums. Before she could finish, Blake's hand shot out, seizing her frail arm with a force that made her gasp. She stumbled, her balance failing her, and in an instant, she was on the ground, the cold earth pressing against her cheek as Carter snapped handcuffs around her wrists. Pain flared through her body, But it was the humiliation that stung deeper thighs of strangers watching. The weight of their silence. Esther's heart pounded, a frantic rhythm of fear and disbelief. She'd lived through hardship before, poverty, loss, the quiet indignities of age, but this was different. This was cruelty wearing a badge, power twisted into something ugly. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain, but Blake only tightened his grip, sneering down at her like she was nothing. Around them, a small crowd gathered, their murmurs rising like a distant storm. Some fumbled for their phones, recording the scene with shaky hands, but no one stepped forward. Fear held them back, a familiar paralysis Esther could feel in the air. But not everyone was frozen. Across the park, Mike Tyson walked the tree-lined path, his broad shoulders cutting a striking figure against the afternoon light. The former heavyweight champion was no stranger to chaos. Life had been a tapestry of triumph and turmoil, woven with threads of raw strength and hard-earned redemption. These days, he came to Greenwood Park to escape the noise, to breathe in the stillness after years of living in the ring's relentless glare. The shouts near the pond broke that stillness, pulling his attention like a magnet. His sharp eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. Two officers towering over a frail, elderly woman. Her body crumpled against the dirt, her voice lost beneath their barking commands. Mike stopped, his breath catching as a surge of anger flared in his chest. He didn't know Esther, didn't know her story, but he knew what he saw would mirror to moments in his own past, when power had been wielded against the powerless, when he'd been judged by his skin. His roots, his mistakes, the sight of her gray hair tangled in the grass, her eyes wide with terror, ignited something primal in him. His fists clenched at his sides, muscle memory from 1,000 fights stirring beneath his calm exterior. But this wasn't the ring. This was something uglier, something that demanded more than brute force. Without hesitation, he closed the distance, his heavy footsteps thudding against the path. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing the shift in the air as he approached. Blake and Carter barely noticed him at first, too consumed by their own authority. It wasn't until Mike's voice, slow, steady, and edged with steel, cut through their shouting that they turned. "Hey," he said, planting himself a few feet from them. "What are you doing? She's just sitting on a bench. Is this your idea of justice?" Carter's head snapped up, his brow furrowing as he sized Mike up. "This isn't your business," he snapped, his tone icy with disdain. "Move along before you regret it." Blake smirked, loosening his grip on Esther just enough to glance at his partner. "Look at this guy," he said, chuckling darkly. "Thinks he's some kind of hero. Doesn't even know who she is." Mike took a slow, deliberate breath, his gaze never wavering. He could feel the old fury bubbling beneath his skin, the kind that had once fueled knockouts and headlines. But he'd learned control since then, learned to channel that fire into something sharper. "I don't need to know her," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "To see you're treating her like she's less than human. She's old enough to be your grandmother. Let her go now." Carter stepped forward, his hand resting on his baton, a sneer curling his lips. "We're officers of the law," he said, his words dripping with arrogance. "We don't take orders from outsiders. Back off, or you're next." The threat hung heavy, but Mike didn't flinch. He stood taller, a mountain of resolve, his presence a silent challenge to their bravado. In his mind, a single thought echoed: if I walk away, who stands up for her? He'd spent too much of his life fighting for himself to let this moment pass. Esther, still on the ground, lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting Mike's in them. He saw not just fear, but a flicker of hope, a plea for Simeone and Yodo care. That look anchored him, steadied him. He took another step forward, his voice rising just enough to carry. "You think that badge gives you the right to hurt whoever you want? That's not law. That's cowardice, and I'm not moving until you let her go." The standoff stretched taut, the park holding its breath. Blake and Carter exchanged a glance, their confidence faltering as they realized who stood before them, not just a stranger, but a legend whose name still echoed with power. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, phones still rolling, capturing every second. For Esther, the pain in her wrists was fading beneath a swell of gratitude. For Marcus, miles away, this moment would soon become a story whispered through the city's spark of courage that fanned the flames of change. And for Elijah, It was proof of what his father had said. Justice wasn't a gift, it was a fight worth waging, every single day. The air was thick with tension as the elderly woman stood there, her frail frame trembling under the weight of the metal handcuffs biting into her wrists. Her face, etched with deep lines of exhaustion and years of struggle, tilted upward toward Mike, her savior in this unexpected storm. Her eyes shimmered with a fragile blend of fear and flickering hope, as though she couldn't quite believe someone had stepped into the chaos to shield her. Mike, towering and steady, bent down toward her with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his imposing figure. His voice, soft yet firm, carried a quiet urgency as he asked, "Are you okay? What did they do to you?" His gaze lingered on her, searching her weathered features for answers she hadn't yet found the strength to voice. Inside, his chest tightened with a mix of concern and rising anger. Could feel the injustice radiating from her hunched posture, her shaky breaths. Before she could muster a response, Officer Carter's voice sliced through the moment like a jagged blade. "I already told you to back off," he barked, his tone dripping with defiance and challenge. "You're obstructing law enforcement." His stance was rigid, his hand hovering near his belt as if daring Mike to push him further. Carter's eyes glinted with a reckless confidence, the kind born from wielding power to long without question. Mike straightened up slowly, his own eyes locking onto Carter's with an unyielding resolve that seemed to fill the space between them. "Obstructing what?" He shot back, his voice steady but laced with a simmering edge. "You've got no legitimate reason to arrest her. You haven't explained a single thing. No charges, no evidence. I'm not about to stand here and watch you trample over her rights just because you think you can." His words hung heavy in the air, a quiet thunder rolling through the growing unease. Beside Carter, Officer Blake shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing the pavement as he took a hesitant step back. The arrogance he'd worn like a badge moments ago faltered, his brows knitting together as he glanced at the swelling crowd around them. People had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion like moths to a flame. Phones were out, screens glowing as shaky hands recorded every second of the standoff. Blake's jaw tightened, and though he tried to cling to his bravado, his voice wavered as he muttered, "Listen, big guy, this isn't your business. Walk away now if you don't want trouble. Who won't hesitate to use force." The threat felt hollow even as he said it, his eyes darting nervously to the onlookers. Inside, a gnawing doubt clawed at him. Had they gone too far? Mike didn't flinch. He rose to his full height, his broad shoulders squared, his presence commanding the scene like a mountain refusing to bow to the wind. "I'm not someone you can scare off with empty threats," he said, his deep voice resonating with a calm authority that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. "I'm here to protect her, to stop you from crossing a line you'll wish you hadn't. Think hard about what you do next and make a choice you'll regret." His words weren't just a warning, they were a promise, delivered with the weight of a man who'd faced down giants and come out standing. A ripple of murmurs stirred through the crowd, voices overlapping in a rising tide of recognition. "That's Mike Tyson," someone whispered, awe threading through the words. "He's protecting that old lady." The realization spread like wildfire, igniting the onlookers' curiosity and outrage. Carter's impatience flared as the attention zeroed in on Mike. With a scowl twisting his features, he lunged forward, shoving at Mike's chest in a desperate bid to reassert control. But Mike didn't budge it an inch. His feet stayed planted, his frame an immovable wall, and his eyes turned icy, glinting with the same steely focus he'd once carried into the ring. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each syllable a hammer striking stone. "If you've got an explanation, give it now. Otherwise, let her go." Carter's arrogance flared brighter, fueled by frustration and wounded pride. "Who do you think you are?" he shouted, his voice cracking with indignation. "Just because you're some famous guy doesn't mean you get to meddle in police work." His chest puffed out, but the gesture felt performative, a flimsy shield against the growing scrutiny. Mike let out a soft chuckle, a sound that rumbled with quiet menace, though his eyes remained razor-sharp. "Who I am doesn't matter," he replied, his tone cutting through Carter's bluster like a blade. "What matters is that I won't let you keep treating an innocent woman like this. Look around. Avirion's watching, every phone's recording. Do you really want this to be the story that follows you? A viral video of you abusing your power? Blake's gaze darted to the crowd, where the murmurs had escalated into chants. Let her go. A young woman cried, her voice sharp and defiant as she held her phone aloft, capturing every moment. Her dark hair whipped in the breeze, and her eyes blazed with righteous fury, a fire stoked by the sight of the elderly woman's trembling hands. Nearby, a middle-aged man pushed forward, his weathered face flushed with anger. She was just sitting there on the bench, minding her own business, he bellowed, his voice rough with indignation. You've got no cause to drag her off like this, his fists clenched at his sides, a lifetime of frustration boiling over as he glared at the officers. The pressure was mounting, a palpable force pressing down on Blake and Carter. Carter, still clinging to his bravado, shouted back, "Back off, all of you. You're obstructing us, and we'll arrest every last one of you for causing a disturbance." His words were meant to intimidate, but they only fanned the flames. The crowd's anger surged, a collective roar building in their throats. An elderly woman, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, stepped forward from the throng. Her voice quavered with age, but rang with unshakable conviction. "No one's afraid of you," she cried, her gnarled hands trembling as she pointed at the officers. "This isn't Justicite's tyranny. You should be ashamed." Her words struck like a bell, echoing through the gathered onlookers and amplifying their resolve. Mike held Carter's gaze, unflinching, and took a deliberate step forward. "Let her go," he said, his voice a quiet command that carried the weight of inevitability. "Everyone here sees what you're doing. If you don't stop now, this won't just cost you your badge, it'll tear apart whatever trust people still have in you." His eyes bore into Carter's, a silent challenge that dared him to push further. Carter hesitated, his bravado cracking as he glanced at Blake for support. But Blake, his face paling, snapped, "Put her in the car. We can't let them think we're backing down." His tone was stern, but his hands shook as he gestured toward the elderly woman, doubt gnawing at his gut. Carter nodded and moved toward her, his boots thudding against the pavement with forced determination. Before he could reach her, Mike stepped swiftly into his path, a human barricade radiating quiet strength. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a thunderous wave crashing over the scene. At that moment, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as a patrol car screeched to a halt nearby. A middle-aged man emerged, his stern face carved with lines of authority. Lieutenant Taylor, Blake and Carter's superior. His sharp eyes swept over the chaotic tableau, taking in the elderly woman's fearful expression, the crowd's simmering outrage, and Mike's unyielding stance. "What's going on here?" Taylor demanded, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the noise like a gavel. Blake turned to him, relief flickering across his features. "Sir, we're trying to apprehend a suspect, but this guy's been obstructing us and riling up the crowd," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. Mike stepped forward, meeting Taylor's gaze with calm assurance. "They're not apprehending a suspect, they are abusing their power," he said, his voice steady and clear. "She was just sitting on that bench over there, not bothering a soul. They didn't ask questions or investigate. They threw her down, cuffed her, and treated her like a criminal for no reason at all." Taylor's eyes narrowed as he turned to the elderly woman. She stood there, her thin shoulders hunched, her hands still bound, her gaze darting between fear and a fragile hope that this man might bring an end to her ordeal. Taylor's jaw tightened, and he swung his attention back to Blake and Carter. "Do you have any justification for this?" he asked, his tone cold and precise. "Any evidence, any report to back this up?" Blake stammered, his confidence crumbling. We thought she might be a suspect who escaped earlier today. It was instinct, sir." Taylor's eyebrow arched, his expression hardening. "Instinct," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Or were you just looking for someone weak to push around? I want your reports now." Silence fell over Blake and Carter, their bravado extinguished under Taylor's piercing stare. He turned to Mike, his demeanor softening slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Tyson, for stepping in," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "You've helped us uphold what's right here. I'll take it from now." Then, with a sharp turn, he barked at the officers. "Remove those handcuffs and get out of here. I'll deal with you two later, Blake's hands trembled as he fumbled with the cuffs, finally freeing the elderly woman's wrists. She rubbed them gingerly, her eyes welling with tears of relief as the crowd's cheers swelled around her. In that moment, the scene became a stark lesson. Justice wasn't just a word, but a fragile thread that could unravel when power was wielded without care. For Carter and Blake, the consequences loomed large, a reckoning that would echo beyond this day. For Mike, it was a stand not just for one woman, but for the principle that no one should be crushed under the weight of unchecked authority. And for the crowd, it was a reminder that their voices, united, could tip the scales toward what was right. In the heart of a bustling park, where the sun filtered through sprawling oak trees and the air buzzed with the hum of life, Carter stumbled backward, his face a mask of unease. His boots scuffed against the dusty path as the crowd around him exploded into a roaring cheer, a tidal wave of voices crashing through the open space. Amid the chaos, a man's shout pierced the din, sharp and fervent. "Mike Tyson is our hero." The words hung in the air, heavy with admiration. But Mike himself stood apart from the jubilation. His broad shoulders remained still. His expression unreadably, no flicker of pride or thrill danced across his weathered face. Instead, he lowered himself gently, his massive frame bending with surprising tenderness toward the elderly woman, crumpled on the ground before him. Her frail hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her worn shawl, and Mike's deep voice softened as he murmured, "Are you okay, ma'am? I'll make sure you're safe." She lifted her eyes to meet his, tears carving silent paths down her wrinkled cheeks, and gave a faint nod. Gratitude shimmered in her gaze, fragile yet profound. With steady hands, Mike helped her rise, guiding her fragile form upright as the crowd's cheers swelled once more, a symphony of support echoing through the trees. He led her away from the chaos, her steps faltering, but bolstered by his quiet strength, toward a weathered bench nestled beneath a sagging willow. Yet even as he moved, a weight settled in his chest. He knew this moment was merely a ripple in a much larger storm, a story far from its end. As the elderly woman sank onto the bench, her breath shallow and uneven, Mike turned back to face the sea of faces. The crowd stretched before him, a patchwork of anticipation and simmering outrage. Their eyes locked on him. Beyond them stood Lieutenant Taylor, his uniform crisp but his posture rigid with tension. Mike's gaze sharpened, no longer clouded by the raw anger that had flared earlier. Now, it burned with something deeper: determination, a quiet fire fueled by responsibility. The crowd had quieted, their cheers fading into a restless hum, waiting for what would come next. Mike stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the earth, and when he spoke, his voice rolled out like thunder over the park, resonant and unshakable. "Today, we saw something that should never happen. Power turned rotten, abused by those meant to wield it with care." This woman, he gestured toward the bench, where she sat clutching her shawl, her eyes fixed on him. She did nothing wrong, nothing. Yet she was harassed, beaten, humiliated by the very people sworn to protect her. If none of us had been here to see it, would it have stopped? Would justice have even had a chance? His words struck the crowd like a match to dry grass, igniting a fresh wave of shouts and cheers. A burly man near the front, his face flushed with indignation, bellowed, "We see this all the time, cops acting like kings. But no one ever does a damn thing." Mike's eyes swept over the faces before him, taking in their anger, their hope, their weariness. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "That's why I can't stay quiet. This isn't new. It's not the first time power's been twisted like this. But I'll be damned if it's not the last time we let it slide without a fight. I don't know this woman's name, her story, but I know she didn't deserve what happened. And I know every single one of us has a duty to stand up for what's right." From the edge of the crowd, Lieutenant Taylor stepped forward, his polished badge glinting in the afternoon light. He raised a hand, palm out, commanding silence, and the murmur of the crowd dulled to a hush. His voice, steady but laced with a tremor of shame, carried across the park. "I hear your anger, and I feel it too. I'm an officer myself, and what I saw today with those two under my command it sickens me. That's not who we're supposed to be. It's not what this uniform stands for. I swear to you, we'll dig into this. We'll investigate every second of what happened, and those responsible will face the consequences." His words hung in the air, earnest but fragile, and Mike turned to face him, his piercing eyes locking onto Taylor's. He took a step closer, his presence towering yet calm. "Promises are a start, Lieutenant, but they're just words. What matters is what you do. Not just with those two officers, Blake and Carter, but with the whole damn system that let this fester. A system that's turned a blind eye too many times." Taylor held his gaze, the weight of Mike's words pressing against him. For a moment, he faltered, his lips parting as if to protest, but then he straightened, nodding firmly. "You're right. I'll see this through myself. Abuse like this, it's a poison. It won't stand, not on my watch." Mike turned back to the crowd, their eyes still riveted on him. A sea of faces reflecting every shade of emotion: rage, hope, exhaustion, resolve. His voice softened, but its power remained, steady as a heartbeat. "We can't let this keep happening. The police aren't our enemies, not all of them. But the ones who twist their power, who prey on the weak, they don't belong among us. Today, we stood together. Let's keep standing, not just for her." He nodded toward the elderly woman, now watching him with quiet awe, "but for everyone who's vulnerable. Everyone who deserves to live without fear." The crowd erupted once more, applause thundering through the park, shaking the leaves overhead. A young woman near the front thrust her phone into the air, its camera trained on Mike as she shouted, her voice cracking with fervor. "Mike Tyson's not just a legend in the ring's a hero for justice." Beside her, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weathered jacket cupped his hands around his mouth and roared, "We're with you, Mike. Justice has to mean something." Their words wove into the clamor, a chorus of defiance and unity. Mike turned back to the elderly woman, who still sat trembling on the bench, her thin fingers twisting the frayed hem of her shawl. The fear in her eyes had softened, replaced by a flicker of trust as she looked up at him. Her voice, hoarse and quavering, broke the air. "Thank you, young man. Didn't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Mike crouched beside her, his massive frame shrinking to meet her level, and offered a smile, gentle, unguarded, the kind that carried years of hard-earned warmth. "No need to thank me, ma'am. I just did what's right, what anyone should have done." He rose, extending a hand to help her stand, and she took it, her grip weak but steadying as he guided her slowly out of the park. The crowd parted for them, some still filming with their phones, others murmuring words of support that floated like whispers on the breeze. Mike felt the weight of their eyes, their expectations, but also their hope. A fragile seed he'd planted with a single act. For him, justice wasn't a crown to wear or a battle to win alone. It was a fire that needed tending, a burden the whole community had to carry. Behind him, Lieutenant Taylor turned to face Blake and Carter, who lingered at the edge of the scene like shadows cast by a dying light. His voice dropped, cold and cutting as steel. "You'd better brace yourselves. This isn't getting swept under the rug. You've dragged shame across this entire force." Carter opened his mouth, his face twisting in a desperate bid to protest, but Taylor's hand shot up, silencing him. "I don't want excuses. Not a single word. This will be handled properly. Now get out of here. Go." Defeated, their bravado stripped bare, Blake and Carter slunk away, their heads bowed under the crowd's scornful stares. Their once proud strides were reduced to a shuffle, the clink of their badges now a hollow sound against the jeers that followed them. As Mike walked the elderly woman toward the park's exit, her arm looped through his for support. He replayed the day in his mind, the image of her frail body hitting the ground, the officer's smug indifference, the crowd's shift from shock to fury. It churned within him. He knew he couldn't dismantle the system single-handedly, couldn't erase the rot that had taken root. But today, his voice, his hands, his refusal to look away, he'd sparked something. Change didn't come in a flood. It crept in through cracks, through moments like this, when silence was broken and courage took its place. He glanced down at the woman beside him, her steps slow but growing surer, and felt a quiet resolve settle in his bones. This was how it started on act, one stand, one ripple that could grow into a wave. By the time Mike ensured the elderly woman whose name, he'd learned, was Martha Johnson, reached her small clapboard house a few blocks away. The park incident had already ignited across social media, videos captured by the crowd flooded platforms within hours. Raw footage showing Blake and Carter's brutality juxtaposed with Mike's towering defiance. The images spread like wildfire. Martha's trembling form on the ground, the officer's hands gripping her arms, Mike's voice cutting through the chaos. Public outrage swelled, a tidal wave of comments and shares demanding accountability. Under mounting pressure, the police department acted swiftly. Lieutenant Taylor, true to his word, suspended Blake and Carter that evening, their badges stripped pending a full investigation. An independent team from the Department of the Interior was assembled, tasked with unraveling not just the officers' actions, but the systemic failures that had shielded them. The investigators moved with precision, gathering a mosaic of evidence, shaky crowd videos showing Martha sitting peacefully on the bench, her hands folded in her lap. Before Blake and Carter descended, their force unprovoked and excessive, Martha's halting testimony, her voice breaking as she recounted the terror of being thrown down and cuffed for no reason. Mike's steady account, his words measured but searing as he described the officer's arrogance. Digging deeper, the team unearthed the trail of prior complaints against Blake and Carter, whispers of power trips, and heavy hands that had been buried under bureaucratic apathy. Each piece painted a damning picture not just of two rogue officers, but of a system that had failed to uproot its weeds. For Mike, walking away from Martha's porch with her soft "God bless you" still echoing in his ears, the lesson was clear. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a garden cultivated through vigilance, through voices that refused to fade. And as the crowd's cheers lingered in his memory, he knew the fight was only beginning. On a crisp afternoon, the air outside the police station buzzed with tension as a small but determined group of protesters gathered, their hands clutched banners that fluttered in the wind, emblazoned with bold demands for justice and sweeping police reform. The chants were soft at first, almost hesitant, but grew louder as more voices joined in, each one fueled by a simmering frustration that had been ignored for far too long. Television crews and reporters swarmed the scene, their cameras capturing every flicker of emotion, every raised fist, as the story unfolded live across screens nationwide. At the heart of it all stood Mike Tyson, a towering figure whose presence carried the weight of both his past triumphs and his newfound purpose. In a quiet yet commanding voice, he spoke to a journalist, his words cutting through the noise like a blade. The people who can't speak for themselves, the ones who feel small and powerless, they need someone to shield them, not scare them. His tone was steady, but his eyes burned with a fierce conviction that stirred something deep in those who heard him. The public listened, and his words rippled outward, igniting debates in living rooms and lighting up phone screens with a flood of reactions. Human rights groups, long weary of systemic failures, seized the moment, amplifying the call for accountability and pressing the police department to lay bare the truth. Inside the station, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Officers Blake and Carter sat before an internal disciplinary committee, their uniforms crisp but their faces etched with unease. The room was stark, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the worn wooden table between them and the panel. Blake leaned forward, his voice tight with defensiveness as he tried to justify their actions. "We were just doing our jobs," he insisted, his fingers drumming nervously on the table's edge. "We had to act fast to keep everyone safe. Things could have gotten out of hand." His words hung in the air, brittle and unconvincing, especially as grainy video footage from the park played silently on a screen behind him. The images told a different story. An elderly woman, Mrs. Martha, her frail frame hunched in fear as the officers loomed over her, their movements sharp and unyielding. The committee chair, a stern woman with gray streaks in her hair, leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Where was your evidence?" she demanded, her voice low but unyielding. "You had no grounds to target her, no verification, nothing but your own assumptions. You skipped every protocol we've drilled into you." Blake's jaw tightened, but he had no answer. Beside him, Carter shifted uncomfortably, his broad shoulders slumping as he muttered a plea for leniency. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice cracking. "Give us a chance to make it right." Lieutenant Taylor, a weary man with a weathered face and a reputation for fairness, stood at the head of the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He'd seen too many cases like this, officers who thought power was a blank check. But this time felt different, heavier. "You've had chances," he said, his voice steady but laced with disappointment. "Time and again, we've trusted you to uphold what this badge means. But what you did out there, you didn't just break rules. You shattered the faith people have in us." His words landed like stones, and for a moment, the room was silent save for the faint hum of the projector. The committee deliberated behind closed doors, their murmurs a dull roar in Blake's and Carter's ears. When the verdict came, it was swift and final: dismissal for abuse of power and gross ethical breaches. Their files were bundled up and sent to the Department of Justice, where the specter of criminal charges and lawful force, human rights violations loomed over them like a storm cloud. The announcement was made public that evening, broadcast across every news channel as the police department vowed to overhaul itself, to prevent such failures from festering again. Out in the world, Mike Tyson stood under the glow of streetlights, surrounded by a growing crowd at a community meeting. His broad frame was still, but his presence pulsed with energy as he reflected on the decision. "It's a start," he said, his deep voice carrying over the murmurs of agreement. "A step towards something better. But it's more than that, it's a warning. To everyone who thinks they can hide behind a badge or a title, your time's up. Silence won't shield you anymore." His words weren't just a reaction, they were a promise, one he'd already begun to keep. Mike had thrown himself into the community, attending meetings, shaking hands, listening to stories of fear and hope. For him, this wasn't just about that one ugly moment in the park, it was a clarion call. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a flame that needed guarding, no matter who stepped up to hold the torch. The incident, sparked by his defiance and cemented by his resolve, became a turning point. A pebble tossed into still waters that sent waves crashing through the police system. Under the weight of public outrage and Lieutenant Taylor's unyielding determination, the department unveiled a sweeping reform plan. Taylor stood before a podium at a press conference, his uniform crisp but his eyes tired, as he outlined the changes. "Every officer will go through mandatory training," he declared, his voice firm despite the exhaustion creeping in. "Ethics, cultural sensitivity, de-escalation, these aren't suggestions, they're requirements. We're here to protect, not to control." A new system for complaints rolled out alongside it, sleek and anonymous, designed to let citizens speak without fear. Every report would be dissected by an independent panel, far removed from the department's internal politics. To ensure no whisper of wrongdoing slipped through the cracks, officers were urged to call out their peers' missteps, promised protection if they did. Taylor knew the road ahead was steep. Trust, once broken, didn't mend overnight, but he staked his career on making it work. Mike, though not bound by any badge, became the beating heart of the push for change. At every gathering, he was there, his voice booming over the chatter as he recounted the day that set it all in motion. "We saw something that should have never happened," he told a packed crowd one evening, his hands gesturing wide as if to pull them all in. "An old woman, harmless, minding her own business, and they went after her, beat her down like she was nothing. Those officers were supposed to be her shield, not her threat. If we hadn't been there, if no one had spoken up, would it have stopped? Would she have gotten justice?" The crowd roared back, a wave of agreement crashing over him. A man in a faded jacket shouted from the back, "We see this all the time, but no one does anything." Mike's gaze swept the sea of faces, his nod slow and deliberate. "That's why I can't sit quiet," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "This isn't new. It's happened before, too many times. But it's got to be the last time we let it slide without a fight. I didn't know Mrs. Martha, but I know she didn't deserve that. And I know we've all got a duty to stand for what's right." Lieutenant Taylor stepped up beside him, raising a hand to hush the crowd. His uniform gleamed under the lights, but his expression was heavy, burdened by the weight of what he'd seen. "I hear you," he said, his voice ringing out. "I'm an officer myself, and I'm ashamed of what my colleagues did. That's not who we are, not who we're supposed to be. I swear to you, we'll dig into this, and those responsible will answer for it." Mike turned to him, his sharp eyes locking onto Taylor's. "Words are nice," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But doing's better. Don't just fix those two, fix the whole damn system that let them think they could get away with it. Taylor paused, the challenge sinking in, then gave a curt nod. You're right, he said. I'll see this through myself. No one's above the law in my department. Mike faced the crowd again, his calm radiating like a champion in the ring. We can't let this keep happening, he said, his voice rising. The police aren't our enemies, but the ones who twist their power. They don't belong here, today. We stood together. Let's keep that strength not just to protect the weak, but to make sure no one's got to live scared. The applause was deafening, a thunderclap of unity. A young woman thrust her phone into the air, filming as she shouted. Mike Tyson's not just a boxing legend, he's a hero for justice, a middle-aged man. His face lined with years of hard work. Bellowed, we're with you, Mike. Justice has to win. Mike turned back to Mrs. Martha, who'd been watching from the edge of the scene. Her hands still shook, but the terror in her eyes had softened, replaced by a fragile spark of hope. She reached out, her voice raspy but warm. Thank you, young man. I didn't know if I'd make it without you. Mike's smile was gentle, his massive hand steadying her as he replied, You're safe now. That's what matters. In that moment, the lesson was clear. Power unchecked breeds ruin. But justice, fought for with unwavering resolve, can reshape the world. In the late afternoon light filtering through the sprawling trees of the park, Mike Tyson moved with deliberate calm, his broad shoulders cutting a steady path through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. Beside him shuffled an elderly woman, her frail frame trembling slightly in it from the cool breeze rustling the leaves, but from the ordeal she'd just endured. Her thin, weathered hands gripped his arm for support, and though she didn't speak, her eyes glistened with a mixture of relief and unspoken gratitude. No need to thank me, ma'am, Mike said softly, his deep voice carrying a quiet reassurance that seemed to settle her nerves. I only did what any decent person ought to. That's all. His words weren't loud, but they hung in the air, a simple declaration of duty that felt heavier than the moment itself. As they stepped beyond the park's edge, the chaotic hum of the crowd faded into a distant buzz. Some onlookers lingered, their phones still raised, capturing every second of the scene unfolding before them. Some muttering commentary under their breath, others shouting encouragement or condemnation. Mike didn't turn to look. His focus remained ahead, guiding the woman to safety, but deep within, a flicker of awareness stirred. What he'd done today wasn't a grand revolution. It was a single, small act, a pebble tossed into a still pond. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the ripples had already begun to spread, touching hearts he'd never meet, planting a fragile seed of hope in those who'd borne witness. For Mike, justice wasn't a burden one man could carry alone. It was a flame the whole community had to tend, lest it flicker out under the weight of apathy or fear. Behind him, the tension in the park shifted like a storm cloud breaking. Lieutenant Taylor stood tall, his weathered face etched with a stern resolve that masked the turmoil churning inside. He turned sharply toward Officers Blake and Carter, his voice dropping to a low, icy growl that cut through the fading clamor. You'd better brace yourselves, he said, each word deliberate, heavy with the promise of reckoning. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. You've dragged the reputation of this entire force through the mud. Carter opened his mouth, a protest forming on his lips, his eyes wide with a mix of defiance and desperation. But Taylor's hand shot up, silencing him before a single syllable could escape. I don't want to hear it. No excuses. We're handling this the right way starting now. Get out of here. Go. His tone left no room for argument, a steel wall slamming down between them. Blake and Carter stood frozen for a heartbeat, their uniforms suddenly feeling too tight, too heavy. The pride they'd once worn like armor had crumbled, leaving them exposed under the crowd's piercing stare size filled with scorn, disappointment, and a quiet fury. Blake's jaw clenched, his fists balled at his sides as he fought the urge to lash out, to reclaim some shred of control. Carter's shoulders slumped, his gaze dropping to the grass as if he could disappear into it. Without another word, they turned and trudged away, their boots scuffing the path, each step echoing the hollow defeat they couldn't outrun. The crowd parted silently, a sea of judgment watching them go. Meanwhile, Mike escorted Mrs. Martha Johnson toward her modest home on the edge of town. The walk was slow, her steps unsteady, but he matched her pace without complaint. His mind churned as they went, replaying the scene in the park, the glint of sunlight on the officers' badges, the thud of misses, Martha hitting the ground, the sharp crack of her startled cry piercing the air. He hadn't set out to be a hero. He wasn't naive enough to think he could dismantle the whole rotten system single-handedly. But as the elderly woman leaned on him, her trust a silent weight against his arm, he felt the gravity of what he'd done. One act of defiance, one refusal to stay silent had sparked something. Change didn't come crashing in like a tidal wave, he mused. It crept in through the cracks, born from moments like this when someone dared to stand up and say enough. By the time they reached her doorstep, the incident had already ignited across social media. The crowd's shaky videos blurred glimpses of Blake, and Carter's aggression juxtaposed with Mike's steady intervention fluid every platform. Within hours, the images were inescapable. Mrs. Martha's frail form sprawled on the ground, the officer's hands rough and unyielding. Mike stepping in like a quiet giant. Captions screamed outrage, hashtags demanded justice, and the public's fury swelled into a roar that the police department couldn't ignore. Lieutenant Taylor, sitting at his desk with the weight of the day pressing on his chest, made the call. Blake and Carter were suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. His voice was steady as he issued the order, but his hands trembled slightly, betraying the anger and shame gnawing at him. He'd trusted those men. He'd believed in the badge they wore. Now, their actions had stained him beyond repair. An independent team from the Department of the Interior descended on the precinct like hawks, their briefcases stuffed with determination and their eyes sharp with purpose. They wasted no time, combing through every shred of evidence, the crowd's footage, frame by frame, showing Mrs. Martha sitting peacefully on that weathered bench, her hands folded in her lap, no threat to anyone. The officer's sudden, brutal escalation, Mike's testimony, delivered in a calm, measured tone that carried an unshakable truth, and Mrs. Martha's own account, her voice quavering but resolute as she recounted the terror of being yanked from her seat, the cold metal of cuffs biting into her wrists. The team unearthed Blake and Carter's records to a trail of complaints stretching back years, accusations of heavy-handedness and arrogance that had been brushed aside with a wink or a shrug. Each overlooked report was a wound to the system, festering beneath the surface until this moment tore it wide open. Outside the police station, the air crackled with unrest. Small clusters of protesters gathered, their voices rising in chants as they waved handmade signs. Justice for Martha, reform now, no more silence. The wind carried the scent of rain and the faint tang of spray paint as a young artist added bold letters to a banner stretched across the sidewalk. Reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing like lightning, feeding the story to a hungry public. Mike Tyson, now a reluctant symbol, found himself in front of a microphone, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing against him. The voiceless need protecting, not threatening, he said, his words simple but searing. What happened to Mrs. Martha? It's not just her story. It's all of ours. His voice trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the depth of conviction driving it. The crowd listening nodded, some wiping tears, others clenching fists. Human rights groups latched onto his message, amplifying it, demanding transparency, accountability, answers. Inside the precinct, Blake and Carter faced the disciplinary committee, a row of stern faces staring them down across a polished table. Blake leaned forward, his voice tight with desperation as he tried to spin the narrative. "We were doing our job," he insisted, his hands gesturing wildly. "Quick action keeps people safe. That's what we're trained for." But the videos played on a screen behind him told a different Talmers. Martha's quiet stillness, the absence of any threat, the officer's reckless force. The committee chair, a gray-haired woman with a gaze like steel, cut him off. "You had no evidence, no justification. You skipped every protocol we've got." Carter, slouched beside Blake, tried a softer tack, his voice cracking as he begged for leniency. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this. Give me a chance." Taylor, standing in the corner, arms crossed, shook his head. "Chances were given," he said coldly. "You squandered them. You've shattered the trust people put in us." The room fell silent, the verdict inevitable. The committee's decision came swift and final: dismissal for both officers, their badges stripped away for abuse of power and ethical breaches that cut too deep to mend. Their files landed on the Department of Justice's desk, tagged for potential criminal charges in lawful force, human rights violations, a litany of wrongs that couldn't be undone. The announcement hit the airwaves, and the precinct issued a promise: reforms were coming. Training would be mandatory: ethics, cultural sensitivity, de-escalation. A new system for complaints would rise, anonymous and ironclad. Every claim probed by outsiders to keep the truth untainted. Officers would be urged to call out corruption. Fear of reprisal be damned. Taylor stood before the press, his jaw tight, vowing to rebuild what had been broken. "We're not here to rule," he said. "We're here to serve. That's the lesson." When a reporter caught up with Mike, he paused, the elderly woman's face flashing in his mind. "It's a start," he said, his voice steady but laced with cautious hope. "This isn't about me. It's a warning to anyone who thinks power's a free pass. Silence isn't an option anymore." He turned back to the community, speaking at meetings, his presence a quiet force urging others to rise. This wasn't just about a woman in a park, he told a packed room one evening, his words echoing off the walls. "It's about you, all of us. If we don't stand, who will?" The crowd murmured agreement, a shared resolve taking root. For Mike, the fight didn't end with Blake and Carter's fall. It was a spark, a call to guard justice wherever it faltered, a reminder that power unchecked was a poison and that its antidote lay in the hands of those brave enough to act. In the heart of a bustling city, where the hum of daily life often drowned out cries for change, something extraordinary began to unfold. The meeting, spearheaded by Mike Tyson, didn't just ignite a spark of inspiration. Among those who attended, they drew the watchful eyes of journalists and news outlets, casting a blazing spotlight on the long overdue need for reform. Mike, a man whose resolve was as unyielding as steel, stood before crowds with a voice steady and clear, preaching a truth that resonated deep within their souls. Transformation doesn't bloom overnight. It demands patience, an unwavering spirit, and, above all, a collective effort where every hand joins in the labor. His words weren't mere rhetoric. They were a call to arms, a plea for unity in a world too often fractured by indifference. As time passed, the fruits of this labor began to ripen in ways few could have predicted. Among the police force, it was the younger officers, those fresh-faced recruits, still untainted by years of cynicism, all felt the stirrings of a new purpose. Their eyes sparkled with determination as they stepped into neighborhoods not as enforcers, but as neighbors, eager to weave threads of trust with the people they'd sworn to protect. Community interaction programs sprang up like wildflowers after a long winter, each event a bridge spanning the chasm of misunderstanding that had divided officers and residents for far too long. Picture the scenes: school gymnasiums alive with the chatter of children asking questions, church halls echoing with heartfelt testimonies, and quiet residential streets buzzing as officers knocked on doors not to interrogate, but to listen. These weren't just meetings, they were moments of revelation, where stereotypes crumbled and human connections took root. At the center of this swelling tide of change stood Mrs. Martha Johnson, a woman whose name had once been whispered only in sorrow. She'd been the victim of the infamous park incident, a brutal encounter that had left her trembling, her faith in humanity hanging by a thread. Now, though, she emerged as a beacon, her presence radiating a quiet strength that captivated all who saw her. Side by side with Mike Tyson, she stepped into community gatherings, her voice trembling not with fear but with the weight of her story. She spoke of that dark day when shadows had swallowed her hope, urging those around her to raise their voices against the injustices that festered in silence. Her eyes, once dulled by trauma, now blazed with purpose, and in her words, there was a lesson etched in pain. Justice isn't a gift bestowed upon you, it's a garden cultivated through courage, and its neglect invites tyranny. The tale of Mike and Mrs. Martha didn't stay confined to the city's borders. It rippled outward, a stone cast into a still pond, stirring waves that reached every corner of the nation. Their story became a rallying cry, a vivid emblem of what unity could achieve when one soul dared to stand against the tide of wrong. On social media, hashtags like Justice for Martha and Stand With Mike erupted into full-fledged movements, virtual campfires around which people gathered to share their own battles with unfairness. Strangers typed furiously into the night, their screens glowing with tales of resilience, each post a brick in the foundation of a growing revolution. Mike, ever the steadfast leader, didn't rest on this newfound fame. He poured his energy into reshaping the police system from within, while also nudging schools and community groups to craft programs that would plant seeds of fairness and respect in the hearts of the young. For him, this wasn't about glory, it was about planting a legacy that would outlive him. Mrs. Martha, meanwhile, had found a semblance of peace after the storm that had nearly broken her. Physically healed, her spirit mended by the embrace of a community that now saw her as one of their own. She lived with a serenity she'd once thought lost forever. Neighbors greeted her with warm smiles, children waved as she passed, and there was an unspoken pact among them all to shield her from harm. Sitting on her porch one evening, the golden hues of sunset painting the sky, she reflected on that fateful day. "I thought the sun had set on me for good," she'd say, her voice soft but steady. "But Mikey stood tall when I couldn't. Because of him, I believe again, in people, in justice." Her gratitude wasn't just for her own salvation. It was for the awakening she saw around her, a reminder that power, when misused, leaves scars. But when wielded with righteousness, it can heal. Their story wove itself into the fabric of something greater, a testament to the raw, unyielding power of bravery paired with solidarity. It painted a vivid picture, no matter how thick the darkness of circumstance. Justice could pierce through, but only if someone dared to strike the first blow. Change, they showed, wasn't a lightning bolt from the heavens. It was a slow, deliberate march, fueled by every step, every voice raised in defiance of apathy. Mike often found himself lost in thought about it all. Fame didn't swell his chest with pride, nor did accolades line his walls. What warmed his heart was simpler, purer, the knowledge that he hadn't turned away when the moment demanded courage. That single choiceto act to care had lit a flame of hope in countless others. With a quiet smile, he pressed on, knowing this was merely the dawn of a longer fight, one he'd wage until his last breath. And what of the others who orbited their story? Take Officer Daniels, a rookie with a mop of unruly hair and a nervous grin, who'd once dreamed of being a hero like the ones in comic books. At first, he'd stumbled through those community meetings, his palms sweaty as he faced skeptical stares. But as he truly listened to the fears and dreams of the people, something shifted. He began to see his badge not as a shield of authority, but as a promise to serve. Then there was Pastor Grace, a stout woman with a voice that could hush a storm, who opened her church doors to the cause. She'd watched her congregation shrink under the weight of distrust, but now, as officers and families filled the pews together, she felt the stirrings of renewal. These weren't just side players, they were threads in a tapestry, each adding depth to a movement that refused to fade. The saga of Mike Tyson and Mrs. Martha wasn't just a tale of personal triumph. It was a mirror held up to a society teetering on the edge of despair and possibility. It whispered a challenge in a world where unfairness often reigned. A single act of defiance could tip the scales. It didn't matter who you were, a weary mother, a rookie cop, a pastor, or a man named Mike. Your voice could echo, your hands could build. Justice, they taught us, isn't a distant star. It's a flame we must tend daily, through trust, through unity, through the stubborn refusal to let power corrupt unchecked. Their journey carved a path toward a world where compassion and fairness weren't just ideals, but cornerstones. And so, if their story stirs something within you, let it loose, share it, shout it, live it. Together, step by step, we can forge a future where righteousness isn't the exception, but the rule. The fight begins now with us.